Okay, if you wouldn't mind taking your seats, please, we'll make a start.
Yes.
I know there are some latecomers, but we'll make a start anyway because we have a busy schedule. So I'm Mike Savage. I am professor here at the LSE, and I convene this theme of research at the LSE's International Inequalities Institute around wealth, elites, and tax justice. The aim today is twofold. So we have an afternoon expert, let's call it expert round table, which is designed to get us thinking across different areas of interest around wealth, inequality, and how to develop campaigning tools and messages which will get the issue of wealth and inequality more on the public and policy agenda than it currently is. I think many of us in this room, probably all of us in this room, feel frustrated about the way in which political discourse in the UK is not adequately taking up questions of wealth inequality. What we want to do is this afternoon is share some of our findings. This is the II research team, the fabulous II research team, which I'll be introducing as the day wears on. But not just to kind of, overwhelm you with stats, but to try and encourage a conversation really, and to try and draw upon your interests and your expertise and your thoughts about how we take this forward really into further policy development, campaigning work and such like. I should also thank the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who really helped support the communication around this event, and the Fairness Foundation. Will and Frank are here. Thank you for your support. And let me just begin with a few slides to set the scene. I'm just going to be talking for 5 minutes. This is not a presentation as such, but I just wonder, why are we here? Why are we talking about wealth? And this is a theme. This is not a book plug, but this is a theme which I talked about in a book I wrote a couple of years ago, which is what is the huge social transformations taking place in the UK and across much of the rich parts of the world in the last 30 or 40 years, which is simply the takeoff of private wealth of different kinds. This is data taken from the World Inequality Lab. Per head wealth across numerous nations in the UK is in there in the green. And what we have seen really is we reached about $100,000, $200,000 in the 70s, and it's doubled. So we just have seen this mushrooming of wealth, private assets. On the face of it, this may appear to be a wonderful success story, economic growth and all that. But of course, as we know, wealth inequality is massively unequally distributed. Half the UK population have pretty much no wealth. So that really means all of this growth is really geared at the top end, and in particular, top 10%, top 1% and all that. So we are undergoing this huge transformation in economic and social life. Has that adequately been reflected in political debate? Are the political parties talking about this? Not as much as they should be, is all I will say about that. But if we are to understand the challenges of our time, we have to make this absolutely central. Here's another graph, comes out of the same stable, from Thomas Piketty and Gabriel Zuckerman, this famous phrase they use about capital is back, which is the deliberate kind of riff off the kind of Marxist argument, but they're not speaking particularly from Marxist perspective, but it is to get us to think that what they've done here is they've looked at the stocks of wealth as a ratio of national income. And it's kind of getting us to understand societies, not in the way which is often portrayed by kind of entrepreneurs as dynamic and driven by innovation, but actually increasingly driven by stocks of assets and generating things like rentier income, unproductive income, to use their sort of phrases, and how we have to try and recognize that this is creating a social and political landscape in which rentier interests and elite interests are occupying increasing power and voice. So there's that kind of background. How do we understand these transformations? How do we respond to them? How do we try and steer the political agenda? Now, this is a metaphor, which some people don't like it particularly, but I find it's quite a helpful metaphor. Wealth as the inequality iceberg. And the kind of metaphor here is, as you know, the main danger for shipping when they hit icebergs isn't the bit they can see. It's the bit which is underneath the ocean surface, which has the mass of massive ice, and it's that which is the real danger. Because wealth is not a kind of concrete economic form, wealth is a stock of assets, which can be realized in certain situations, as when you sell a home or when you transit into retirement and you can access your pension funds. Because it can be opaque and difficult to measure and to visualize in a way which makes it more amenable to kind of policy discussion. And obviously we are aware of the kind of outcome, the products of wealth, the super yachts and the conspicuous consumption and the super rich, which we'll soon hear about from Andy. That's all important, okay? And there is increasing traction around that issue. And I'm so thrilled that Andy is here to talk about some of the work which he and Aaron and other colleagues have been doing on this. So we are opening up more of a conversation about the visible parts of wealth. But the job is also to kind of expose more of the hidden bits, not just the deliberately hidden bits, of which are a substantial amount, as we know, but also the bits which are just opaque, which are not really adequately in the public domain. We call it a second front. I should say there is this hard copy policy report, which is outside, which talks a little bit about these. And, I'm a sociologist, I'm not an economist. And for me, that second front is really about exposing the social aspects of wealth inequality. And that's why we have a big focus this afternoon on reflecting about issues around gender and wealth inequality, race and wealth inequality, class and social mobility. Making sure if we are concerned, as we surely all are, about gender equality, we have to think about wealth, similarly about race, similarly about class. So we want to try and build a wider awareness of the scale and significance of wealth inequality. So our aim is to take stock of some of the work which particularly has been done on this first front, which is to expose the super rich, and to think about how we develop strategies for taxing the super rich. That'll be the first discussion in a minute. But also really to build upon that and say, this is not just a small technical economic issue around super rich. The danger is that could be seen as a kind of important but specialized area. It actually opens up into all sorts of ways of thinking about the nature of social inequality in the UK. And so I think what we're doing is we will present a series of empirical contributions to get us going around the questions of gender and the wealth divide, race and the wealth divide, or the racial wealth divide, if you like, social mobility and class, and then the issue about how these wealth chasms are affecting the nature of political life, democratic life, and in particular, talking about reflecting on how it's leading to disengagement from people who have no stakes in the wealth game, people who are living in situations of not being able to access wealth. Now, look, we're not presenting these findings as like, we're presenting them as ways of encouraging discussion. We want to draw upon your ideas and your thoughts about how we shape this work up, both in terms of future research, but also in terms of campaigning work and building wider discussions around these issues. That's the aim. So we'll have a series of half-hour slots for each of these. Each of the presenters will talk about 15, 20 minutes on their bit, leave 10 minutes for discussion on the particular issues which they're talking about, but then we'll have a half-hour wrap up at the end, where we can kind of reflect upon the bigger lessons and the bigger learning points of this afternoon session. Now, this afternoon's slot is a kind of closed-ish seminar. Just to emphasize, there'll be a half-hour break when you can get a cup of tea, and that will lead on to the open public event in the same room at 6 o'clock, where we will kind of take the issues but reflect upon them more with a view to influencing people who might be zooming in or coming in to think about how we develop campaigning work around inequality. And that will include Shabna Begum from the Runnymede Trust, Faiza Shaheen, who's coming in a bit later, and myself, and Liz Nelson, an Atlantic Fellow. So 2 bits, but the 2 bits are linked together. So please do stay if you can for the evening session as well. Okay, so let me move on, and I'll introduce the speakers in turn. So the first session will be by Andy Summers. Andy is Associate Professor of Law here at the LSE. As many of you will know, with Aaron Advani, he's been doing some remarkable work going into HMRC Data Lab, extracting incredibly important information about who the super rich are, how to tax them, and as you will also know, having huge policy traction already. So the Conservative government recently sort of abolished the non-dom clause, which is very much a result of the underpinning research which Andy and Aaron have done. So this work is getting traction, and I think it's great to have him here. So he's going to kick off. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody, for coming, and it's a delight to be here to kick off this series of presentations. Before I can say anything else, I'm going to start with the obligatory HMRC disclaimer, which says that although we have used their data, they don't necessarily agree with what we say. Although we have some clue now to the government's own position on this as of the recent budget, and we were reassured to find that Treasury's costings of the same work that that Aaron and I had done comes out quite similar, but still they officially don't endorse anything that we say. The other is to say that this presentation is going to be based on two papers that I've been involved with II colleagues. I'll say more about each of them in a moment, but just to acknowledge those other authors' contributions as well. So the starting point for this presentation is this observation that we know we have evidence from a variety of sources now, not just anecdotal, but quantitative evidence using tax data and other sources, that the super rich, those at the very top of the income and wealth distributions, often pay strikingly low effective tax rates. This idea of a progressive tax system where the tax rate rises as you come higher in the distribution basically breaks down at the very top. That's not to say that all super rich are paying these low effective rates. Actually, one of the other striking things is the sort of heterogeneity within this group. Some of them actually are paying the headline rates, and some are paying very low effective rates. But the worry for policymakers, and this is sort of runs through all the public discourse around taxing the super rich, is this sort of sense of jeopardy or uncertainty that, well, what if we actually sort this out and we do try and tax them more, will they all just leave? And you can see that in any number of media reports and interviews with individuals from these kinds of position. But actually, in a way, sort of more interestingly, more surprisingly, you can see it in the work of academics who are actually themselves very much in favour of taxing the super rich more. You can see it through the focus on policy proposals for a global wealth tax, for example. Now, there's lots we could say about those kinds of proposals, and I'm broadly in support of them. But what kind of underlies them is actually an assumption that individual countries will struggle to do this on their own. So implicit in the proposal for a global wealth tax is actually the same kind of concern about if countries try and tax the super rich on their own, will all these individuals leave? So the question that I want to address through these two papers that I've been involved in is, can the UK go it alone to tax the super rich more? So two pieces of work, recent work with separate authors, but all from the Inequalities Institute here at LSE, and taking quite different approaches to this one. So the first is some work that I was involved in using tax data accessed via the HMRC Data Lab, looking quantitatively at the behavioural responses of these non-DOMs. I'll explain a bit more who they are to a recent reform to the non-dom status. So this is not the reform that's been announced just in March, which obviously hasn't been implemented yet, but an earlier reform that happened in 2017. And then secondly, a piece of work with some co-authors who are in the room today, Sam Friedman, Victoria Grombold and Emma Taylor, looking at this question from a different perspective, using qualitative, in-depth interviews to explore the motivations amongst this group of super wealthy. They were not non-doms, or certainly not all non-doms, but more broadly, this group of very wealthy individuals, about why they choose to live in the UK. Not really using tax actually as a primer. We weren't kind of going through the front door saying, if we tax you more, will you leave? We were trying to explore this more discursively and open-endedly. So I've probably got way too much material here. So I'm going to have to go through some of it quickly, and we can maybe pick up things in questions. But I was keen to give you a sense of both of these papers rather than forcing myself to choose just one or the other, because I think kind of approaching this from both angles, I think, is quite instructive on this question. Okay, so the non-dom regime, I don't know how much people in the audience know about this already. Some will know a lot, others perhaps not very much. A non-dom is basically someone who lives in the UK, so they are technically tax resident in the UK. They could spend 365 days a year and live nowhere else. But they claim that their permanent home, or in other words, their domicile, is abroad. And if you can persuade HMRC of that fact, which broadly speaking means that you have some ties to abroad, for example, you arrived here as a migrant from abroad, and you say you're going to go back at some point, then you have access to these two special tax benefits that are not available to other, what we call UK DOMs, or people that are domiciled in the UK. So the first is this thing called the remittance basis. Without going into all of the extremely complicated details, basically this means that you don't have to pay any tax on your foreign income earnings. You pay income on your UK source income pay tax on your UK source income in the same way as everybody else, but you don't have to pay tax on your foreign income and gains at all, effectively. And the second is in relation to inheritance tax. You are not liable to inheritance tax, again, effectively, on any of your foreign assets, and even some of your UK assets, as long as you hold them through a foreign company, but we won't go into those further details. And so that's the regime that's existed for literally decades, in the case of the remittance basis, more than 2 centuries. But in 2017, there was a reform announced by George Osborne as Chancellor in 2015, where he said that he was abolishing permanent non-dom status. What that involved was essentially withdrawing the access to this remittance basis regime for those long-staying non-doms, people who had already been in the UK for at least 15 of the past 20 years. And for those individuals, they lost access to this first remittance basis tax advantage, and formally they lost access to the inheritance tax advantage as well, although in practice there were ways of getting around that. And so this affected about 3,000 individuals. In terms of a quantitative study, this is not a huge number of individuals, but I'll show you in a moment just how rich they are. Okay, these are individuals who are amongst the most wealthy individuals living in the UK, and they are genuinely highly mobile in the sense that they're maintaining, even after 15 years, that they have sufficient connections abroad that they're intending to go back somewhere else. And in most cases, they arrive to the UK as a migrant. So and we can see that actually in the baseline, about almost 5% of them do leave each year, irrespective of the tax reform. So they are a very highly mobile group. So this provides a kind of ideal natural experiment about taxing the super rich, which is, if we tax these individuals significantly more, will they leave? I mean, obviously, in one sense, they're quite a niche group. In another sense, as I say, they're individuals at the very top and they're amongst the most highly mobile. So if we can tax this group, then we can be reasonably confident that for those, if you like, UK natives who would expect to be less mobile, there's hope. So these results actually aren't in the published paper at the moment. These are the first time that we're presenting these results. And the bottom line is this group are extremely high in the UK income and wealth distribution. They're 2/3 of them are within the top 0.1%. And in fact, if you look to the far right-hand bar there, over 500 of them were in the top 5,000. In other words, the top 0.01%. So, okay, it's only 3,000 individuals, but 500 of them are in the top 5,000 individuals in the whole of the UK for by their income. So this is an extraordinarily rich group, justifying this sort of super rich label. About half of them are in some form of work, and about half of them are living off income from work. So we have a mix of people who are the working rich, if you like, and the sort of maybe your image of the Rowntree rich, or at least passive business owners. Most of them who are working in city jobs, finance and professional services, and they're mostly from the English-speaking world. Apart from that, mostly from Western Europe. And this is probably the least surprising result of the whole presentation, but they all live in London, and in fact, they pretty much all live in Belgravia and within throwing distance of there. It's striking how geographically concentrated this group are, and kind of actually more so even than the wider UK domicile super rich population. So there is a kind of enclave effect, essentially, for this group. So I'm not going to go into the technical details. I don't have time, unfortunately, to go through the technical details of the paper. Essentially, it's a fairly simple difference with individuals who have been in the UK for slightly fewer years than the group that are affected by the reform. And what we find is that, yes, there was an emigration response. More people did leave as a result of the reform on top of that baseline. But from a baseline of about 4% of this treated group leaving each year, that goes up by 6 percentage points. So, you could report that as it's doubled, but from a very low baseline, I suppose I should say, a high baseline compared with the emigration rates of most of the population, but a low baseline if what you're worried about, which is usually the context in which this comes up, that maybe so many people will leave that this will actually cost revenue. And we find that within that, those who left, interestingly, were actually more likely to be those who were paying the least tax prior to the reform. So in other words, the ones who were most effective at using the non-dom regime to shelter themselves from tax were the ones who were more likely to leave. Of course, that implies that the tax loss is actually less than if you just take the simple sort of average. And amongst those who were working in finance, there was virtually no emigration response that we could detect. So it varies according to these individuals' characteristics, but it kind of stands to reason potentially that those who are working in very highly paid city jobs are, in virtue of that, more tied to the UK, and it's not necessarily economical for them, even leaving aside other factors, to try and leave for somewhere else. And then, did they pay more tax? I really want to emphasize this point because I think our study has been, in the context of this recent non-dom reform, somewhat misinterpreted by some tax advisors who will say, yeah, but in 2017, the government offered these things called trust protections, which the general public didn't really know about, but the non-doms did. And so, you know, the reason why nobody left is because nobody was really actually affected by this reform because of the loophole. Now, there certainly was use of trust protections, and that will have reduced the revenue that could have been raised from this reform. The lesson is, you know, don't allow those sorts of loopholes. And actually, to the government's credit, in the March budget just gone, the proposals did remove the trust protection for income tax and capital gains, although we can perhaps discuss later, they kept them for inheritance tax. But it's just not right to say that nobody was really affected. We can see in the data that amongst those who stayed, they paid on average 150% more tax than they were paying before. Just think about that in relation to your own tax bill for a moment. They paid 150% more tax than they were paying before in the UK. That works out at about £100,000 per individual, even accounting for the fact that these individuals no longer had to pay something called the remittance basis charge. So on net, that's how much more tax this affected group paid. And so think again about the 6 percentage point increase in the emigration rate in that context. This is a very large reform affecting some very mobile and very rich individuals, and 6 percentage points additional emigration from that reform. Something else just to point out, not a major point, but people tend to assume that when people do leave, you lose all the tax from them. So the usual kind of Laffer rate type argument goes, well, only a small number of people need to leave, and then this is going to cost the government money, because of course, you know, these people are then not paying any of the tax that they were paying before. Well, number one, as I said, those who left were more likely to be paying the least tax to begin with, but also those who left didn't actually drop to paying zero tax. We find that they still, certainly their tax did drop quite a lot after going non-resident. That's what you would expect, and that's potentially why they left. But it didn't drop to zero. Okay, so that's the evidence from the quantitative work that we have done. But that only gives you kind of part of the picture. The sort of open question then is, well, why didn't they leave en masse? You know, in a way, we're primed so strongly to think that this group are highly mobile and highly responsive to paying more tax, that maybe that quantitative finding is surprising. That study, I think, using tax data is good for providing representative evidence of what people actually do. It's not so useful in itself for trying to understand people's motivations. We can obviously break down these groups in different ways that we can observe, like we split out finance, people working in finance from other groups, and we can infer some things from that. But we can't quite get under the hood. And so this other follow-up study that I was involved in with those others in the room I mentioned, took a different approach, and we interviewed 35 wealthy individuals. As I say, they weren't all non-doms. In fact, we don't know if any of them were non-doms. Perhaps some of them were, but we weren't sampling on that basis. But these were all individuals within the top 1%, many within the top 0.1%. Of the income distribution. And what I want to point out here, first of all, is a contrast between the approach taken in that study to the sorts of interviews that you'll often see in newspapers with these kinds of individuals. And I think there's a couple of main differences. One is, the people who we were talking to didn't know that they were coming to talk about tax. That was actually only mentioned sort of right at the end of the interview, if it hadn't already been mentioned spontaneously. And they weren't using the interview as a platform to prospectively influence policy. A lot of the time when this debate comes up in the media, it's in the context of some proposed reform where obviously those who choose to speak often explicitly are trying to influence policy. Other times more implicitly sort of weighing in. And so clearly we can't claim statistical representativeness for this kind of study. It was too few individuals, but we tried hard, and I can talk, or co-authors can talk if there are questions about how we composed this sample. But we tried to avoid some of the pitfalls that we see in taking sort of credulously the interviews with individuals who know that they're speaking on the record. So these findings, again, I'm going to have to go through this quite swiftly. In fact, I won't be able to. I'll just show you one quote, which is our favourite, I think, of all the author team, and just give you the headlines from the rest. Broadly, the picture was of people who will complain hard, but when push comes to shove, not actually wanting to leave the UK. And a striking stigma with moving to a low tax jurisdiction. The quote about Switzerland is boring actually made it into the title of our paper eventually, but was actually replicated across other jurisdictions as well. And there was a sense that this sort of said something about the individual concerned if they were motivated to move somewhere that was sort of less fantastic than London, that they were doing it for the bottom line, but this actually said something negative about those individuals. And we hadn't necessarily anticipated that sort of that stigmatic angle to our findings. And likewise, there's a fairly choice quote in here as well. Stigma against those who leave for tax reasons as being unduly economically motivated, or and implicitly, again, not willing to see the sort of cultural and other amenities that London has to offer. And it was really quite specifically London that came out from our interviewees as being the sort of strong pull factor for these individuals. And I think, that does sound a slight note of caution in terms of the international comparability of these findings. My question at the start was framed as, can the UK go it alone? And I think both of these studies together provide us with quite good evidence that in fact we can, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every country can, to the extent that London does have something internationally to offer, which not every country will be able to claim. So just to wrap up all questions, I think that clearly there's, as academics always say, there should be more research in this area. We haven't bottomed out all of the important issues here, either quantitatively or qualitatively. But I think that there is already from these two studies strong reasons to doubt the sometimes hysterical narratives that you hear about if you tax the super rich more, they will all leave. The most recent reforms will be effectively a political test, I think, of whether both the current government and the Labour government can hold its nerve, because already there are a lot of calls for amongst tax professionals and amongst the wealthy themselves saying that they will leave as a result of these reforms. In fact, my collaborator, Advani, and I have been keeping a record of the claims that were made along those lines in 2017, and we can now hold those up against the quantitative evidence, but time will tell whether we'll have the opportunity to do that again in 5 years' time. So, thanks.
Tax the super rich, brilliant. We have 5 minutes or a bit more for any questions. Could be to Andy.
It's a round table, so.
Yeah.
Hi, Jonas Gilbert from Oxfam, Denmark. There have been done similar studies in Denmark as well, and we actually had a wealth tax that was then abolished, and they did this for both Denmark and Sweden. And what it showed was there was quite a high responsiveness amongst the top tiers of the wealth distribution, but the quantitative effects were really, really marginal. So it supports what you have found as well. Of course, why so? The composition of the top tiers in the non-dom population is probably different from the top tiers in Denmark. But some of the things we've talked with the researchers about is that one, the mobility of wealth assets, if it's a company, for example, it's really hard to move abroad. It has a lot of transaction costs. And actually they found that income taxation is much more pushing people to migration compared to wealth taxation, which also maybe is a support for moving more towards asset taxation than income taxation in the cases of the top tiers. Secondly, also the group with high wealth are relatively elder compared to the ones that are high earners, because of course you build up wealth during your career. And when you're elderly, you're also less prone to migrate. So these could also be maybe some of the explanations behind.
Yes, yes, I think I guess you're referring to the paper by Camille Monday and McClabe and
Yes, exactly.
and others on the Swedish and Danish wealth taxes. Yeah, so that's a really interesting, further, really recent paper that broadly paints the same kind of picture. I mean, one difference in that context, which you mentioned, is that the baseline rate of migration in Sweden and Denmark was much, much lower than in our study. So I think whereas the baseline migration for our population was 4% a year, in Sweden and Denmark, looking at the whole, this wasn't looking just at migrants to Sweden or Denmark, it was looking at the natives as well. And there the emigration rate was about 10 times less. It was about half a percentage point. So as I say, we think of our study as really marking out a kind of upper bound on the level of tax migration, because we were looking at an extremely rich and extremely mobile population in the baseline. But yeah, definitely, I think that other word points in the same direction.
Great.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. In core research, did anything come up about reflections around if these tax changes had been made earlier, they wouldn't have moved to the UK?
Yes, so certainly we would expect there to be an immigration response as well as an emigration response. In that study, effectively the nature of the reform makes it kind of unsuited to measuring an immigration response, because you only are affected once you've been in the UK for 15 years. So we probably wouldn't expect that to have a very large immediate effect on people coming in at year one. Obviously, the latest reform from the March budget will be a sort of better test of that. But going back to the Sweden and Denmark paper, there they actually found that where they could measure both the immigration margin and the emigration margin, they found that the immigration response was actually less than the emigration response. So if we think that we can learn from these other contexts where they have been able to look at immigration, we wouldn't be too worried that there will be an immigration response that is many times larger than the emigration response that we observed.
And this is from Tanya Birchard, who's online. She says, great presentation and pair of studies. Thanks, Andy. A speculative question, is it possible that the behavioural response to reform brought in by a Labour government would be different to reform brought in by the Conservatives? Perhaps the super rich trust the Tories to not overdo it.
That's a great question, and I think it's one of the challenges of in a sort of precise way estimating the causal effect of a tax policy change when you're just looking kind of at the bare bones of the policy and not all of the sort of social and political context that goes around it. If there are reforms associated with a change in government, then obviously there could be other reasons why those at the top sort of either see the writing on the wall for further reforms, or they don't like other policies of the government, and so on. And that can be quite tricky to disentangle. I think it's one of the reasons why it was really positive that this major reform to the non-dom regime that was announced in the March budget was introduced by a Conservative government. That gives the reform a lot more policy stability than if Labour had done it and then the Conservatives in opposition have been saying, well, if we get back in power, then we'll bring it back. This is effectively cross-party consensus on the removal of this regime. So, you know, that's a very welcome aspect of that latest reform.
One last question. Robert from Tax Justice UK. How big, like, I'd be interested in how big an impact the non-dom change would have had on the kind of like that top 3,000 compared to, say, you know, your proposal for a 1 to 2% annual wealth tax on those earning over 10 million. Like, are there in yours, like, would it be a sort of like similar level, you know, extra tax payment by these individuals? I'm just interested to see how comparable this is to other policy.
Yeah. Good question, and quite difficult for me to answer on the fly, but I think so. You can think of a 1% wealth tax. If you can think of a 1% wealth tax, if someone is achieving, say, a 10% return on their wealth, which I'm told that various advisors have told me that if their wealth management team were not achieving at least 8% for these non-doms, then they'd be fired immediately. So 10% is sort of, let's say, 10% rate of return. A 1% wealth tax is that in that sense equivalent roughly to a 10 percentage point increase in income tax rates. And you can express our study as on average a 17 percentage point increase in the income tax rate. So that gives you some sense of scale. A 1 to 2% wealth tax probably is on that assumption, if all your income comes from wealth, which it doesn't in the case of some of these studies, but will do for the sort of pure rentiers, then you can kind of do a loose conversion like that. But yeah.
Okay, one last question, very quickly. Yes, go on.
Thank you. My name's Hamida Ali. I'm from an organisation called the Future Governance Forum. I was just interested in what the polling is of kind of public opinion of taxing super rich at a higher level, and the extent to which it's like a bit like inheritance tax, like quite a negative public perception, even though most of us are never going to be liable to pay any. So I just wondered, as the kind of opposite end of political pressure, you know, what the stats, if any, say.
Well, I think so. Drawing on some of the public attitudes work that our team did for the Wealth Tax Commission, and I think this has been sort of replicated in various polling exercises since. I think there's strong public support for taxing wealth and the wealthy more. The concerns are around, will they find a way around it, so avoidance, and sometimes this question about what if they leave. And so, I mean, picking off those two concerns, I think, is crucial to bringing the public sort of with us for these reports.
Okay, we shut there. Thanks, Sacha. Okay, so takeaway. One of the takeaways is it can be done, and not everyone will go to Monaco. So the issue is, why should we do it, and how do we build an evidence base around the significance of wealth inequality? And that will lead to the remaining presentations today. And I'm going to start with, this is really original research. This is really new work which is being pioneered here at the IAI and Social Mobility and the Class Origin Wealth Gap. And to present it, Sam Friedman, Professor of Sociology here at the LSE, one of the world's top authorities on social mobility. He wrote a book a few years ago on the class ceiling, which is much discussed, and was a social mobility commissioner. So he's well aware of the debate about how you get governments to reflect upon the difficulties of navigating the quest of social mobility. And then Mina Mahmoudzadeh, who is one of our fantastic researchers, who will be talking about some of the data too. So over to you, Jude.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And just to say on Tanya's question, it was quite striking in those interviews that we did that lots of people mentioned
in a kind of way that was often not very specific. Sort of Jeremy Corbyn as a kind of red line condition, right? So I think there is, Tanya was perhaps getting at something there about often people were sort of giving quite sort of specific red line conditions around this sort of threshold of tax that would make them leave. But in other instances, it was this kind of spectre of a certain style Labour government. So I think there was perhaps something there. Just to finish on that. Mike told you a little bit today about how wealth is perhaps becoming the most concerning axis of socioeconomic inequality in the UK, the inequality iceberg, if you will. Mina and I want to sort of provide a further dimension of this by looking at how wealth is implicated in shaping life chances. And I should say, Mina is really doing the key bits of analysis. I'm just going to provide some framing. So how do we conceptualize the role of wealth in understanding social mobility? I suppose the basic idea here is that the material conditions of people's upbringing, particularly the wealth holdings of parents, can act as a kind of pivotal scaffolding for the life outcomes of their children. Some of this is simply a reflection of what wealth can buy, private schooling, or all sorts of other kinds of educational resources. Parental wealth can also play a more continuous role in children's lives, as in this kind of idea of the bank of mum and dad providing insulation from the uncertainties associated with forging an elite career. And finally, of course, parental wealth can be deployed very directly, right? As in the case of inheritance or inter vivo gifting, which we know can be particularly important in helping people get onto the housing ladder. And certainly we know that inheritance is becoming the kind of key driver of wealth acquisition in the UK, the majority share of all private wealth, and that early life gifting is on the increase. Right? So what do we know about social mobility and wealth in Britain already? Well, traditionally not very much. It's not really been the focus of mobility researchers. However, in recent years, some, including myself and others in this room, like Eleni, have begun to kind of fill this work. So in my own work, I've been focusing on the power of family wealth in shaping kind of recruitment to Britain's top positions, and specifically in a forthcoming book with Aaron Reeves entitled Born to Rule, we look at the historical catalogue of who's who. So that's the kind of biographical dictionary of noteworthy and influential people, the kind of positional elite in the UK, published every year since the late 19th century. And specifically there, we use probate records to track down the wealth at death of parents of some 70,000 people in who's who, compared this to the wealth at death of other people in the UK who died at similar times, and then examine how the chances of reaching the British elite have changed over the course of the 20th century if you are born into a family at the top end of the wealth distribution. We find that those from wealthy backgrounds have historically and continue today to be strongly overrepresented in the British elite. So if you're born into the top 1% of the wealth distribution, it turns out you've consistently been about 15 to 25 times more likely to reach an elite position than others in the UK born in a similar cohort. We also find that that relationship between wealth and elite recruitment has only weakened actually very slightly over the course of the 20th century. You can kind of see that in this graph here. The unfilled lines are where we're trying to account for hidden wealth that becomes more prominent towards the middle of the 20th century. And the fact that this is kind of interesting because of the fact that we know that general wealth inequality actually declined fairly precipitously in the same period. So in other words, despite the changes we know took place in Britain's overall wealth distribution over the course of the 20th century, which kind of shuffled top shares away from the 1% to a broader upper middle class, a home-owning class, this doesn't seem, interestingly, to have dented the ability of wealthy families to propel their offspring into the top or most influential positions in British society. In another project where I looked more sort of qualitatively at how this actually works in terms of elite careers, this was the class ceiling study that Mike talked about. I found that this was really about the kind of security function of parental wealth, the sense of assurance it provides, even if it isn't actually used, right? Even if it's not actually relied upon. So I did a whole bunch of interviews with my colleague Daniel Lorison with professionals in the civil service, in a big accountancy firm, in television. And what this was kind of showing is this pivotal layer of insulation that this financial cushion provides, especially around the kind of uncertainties associated with forging a career in a city like London, where most of the opportunities are clustered, but also this sense of psychological security in terms of a feeling that you can take more risks in your career, spend more time on networking, take that uncertain or short-term role that may, and often did in the case of my interviewees, have a long-term payoff for their career. But beyond those at the top, right? What about wealth and mobility more generally? Well, LSE researchers like Eleni Karagiannaki and Abigail McKnight have made really important, I think, interventions in this area. Perhaps the most up-to-date analysis we have, though, comes from recent IFS research. This shows that children born in the 70s and 80s to the wealthiest fifth of parents in the UK are 8 times more likely to end up in the wealthiest fifth themselves. So that's compared to children, the poorest fifth of parents. So I think there's some obviously powerful evidence in this regard, but we think there's still some important gaps in our knowledge, and that's where Mina's analysis comes in today. Particularly, we know fairly little about how things have changed in recent decades in terms of this wider picture of wealth and social mobility. So the IFS work shows the profound propulsive power of origins on wealth accumulation, but we need to sort of put that in, I suppose, some context. Was origin less powerful in the past? So to answer that, I'm going to pass you on to Mina.
Okay, thanks, Al. So yeah, I guess the question now becomes how have like class origin wealth gaps been changing over recent decades? And so basically this means kind of exploring the relationship between where you start in life and where you kind of end up in life later on in terms of like the wealth distribution, and kind of also exploring the strength of that relationship and how it's changing over decades. And also related to that as well, we'll also be looking at kind of how much more exclusive those top like wealth positions have got over time. So just to like really quickly talk about how I did that. So we used the Understanding Society survey, and I took the year 2000 and the year 2021 were the 2 years that we like collected the data. And so then I kind of got everybody who's 35 to 40 years old in those 2 years, looked at their class origins, looked at their wealth, whatever. And then, so going forward, basically, I'll be talking about 2 groups, and those 2 groups will be referred to as the 1960s birth cohort and 1980s birth cohort, because I guess they were born in 1960 to 65 and 81 to 86. So yeah, so just like a little bit more housekeeping is how did we actually define class origins? So class, there's a lot of different ways to like conceptualize it, a lot of ways to look at it. I used basically the NSEC, which is the UK government's kind of like standard approach to defining class and class origins. So it kind of does that by looking at what people's parents did when they were growing up, basically, kind of their jobs and occupation. So 7 different class origin groups you can be in, according to the NSEC. And so on one side, for instance, you've got class origin 1, which is the professional and managerial origins. So this is kind of considered to be kind of the most advantaged class origin that you can come from. And these are kids whose parents did jobs like they were CEOs, they were university professors, doctors, stockbrokers, things like that. And then on the other end of things, you've got class origin 7, which is called the routine origins. And those are people whose parents did jobs like waiter, cleaner, and bus driver. So then we go on to talk about median net wealth for these 2 different birth cohorts, which we can see here. And basically what we find that in the 1960s birth cohort, basically those who were born in the most advantaged class background, so class origin 1, they held about £17,400 more in terms of wealth when they get to their late 30s compared to those born in the routine origins, which is class origin 7. And then if we like fast forward 20 years later, basically for the 1980s birth cohort, this kind of jumps up to a £75,600 difference for the 1980s birth cohort. And this is all inflation adjusted, by the way, just to say. So clearly there's been quite like a major shift in this time in the class origin wealth gap. And it seems like when we start in life, it's playing a lot more of a significant role in where you can end up in the wealth distribution for younger cohorts today. So also if we just like very quickly look at these graphs, we can try to unpack a little bit of what's going on. So if we start by looking at 5, 6, and 7 at the end, in the NSEC, those groups are sometimes kind of grouped together to be, and they're kind of known as like the working class origin individuals. So if we look between the 1960s and the 1980s, it looks like the abilities of kids from working class origins to kind of attain and maintain wealth in the 30s has kind of really dropped off. Whereas if we look on the other end of things at the most advantaged group, particularly class origin 1, so the most advantaged group, it seems like they're really kind of like running away with it and running away from the pack. They're making a lot more even compared to the same origin group in the generation before. So we have this kind of fall at one end, a rise at the other, and we're seeing this kind of increase in class origin wealth gap over time. So if we also look at this in another way and just focus basically on the top wealth deciles and the bottom wealth deciles and who's kind of falling into those groups. Again, if we look at the 1960s cohort first, we find that those from the most advantaged backgrounds are 1.4 times more likely to end up in the top wealth decile compared to those in the routine origins. And for the 1980s, then that moves up, so they were 4 times more likely to end up in the top wealth decile. So really, it does look like the top kind of wealth destinations are becoming a lot more exclusive over time, and for younger birth cohorts. And those at the top, who start at the top basically, are becoming better at kind of hoarding all of those kind of top wealth destinations, while those at the bottom are finding it harder and harder to be upwardly mobile into those top wealth destinations. Again, if we like look at the graphs, we can unpack a little bit what's going on. So if we start again with class origin 1, so the most advantaged individuals, it's interesting that in the 60s and the 1980s birth cohort, there's like the same proportion of individuals ended up in the top decile, so it's about 15%. But what's really changing is the proportion of individuals from the most like advantaged class origins who are falling into that bottom decile. So it changes from about 15% to 4%. So I guess what we're seeing here is kind of like this glass door effect. So for the 1980s cohort, there's something about the backgrounds of these advantaged origin people, which is kind of really like insulating them from downward mobility and insulating them from like falling into those bottom kind of wealth deciles. Yeah, and so then I guess the question becomes like, what's driving this difference? Like what's driving that growth from the £17,000 difference to the £75,000 difference between the 60s and the 80s? So I guess when we talk about class differences, one of the things we usually think about in terms of the differences between people from less advantaged and more advantaged class backgrounds is education and income. So if we think about a more kind of education mediated route into wealth acquisition, we can think of those from more advantaged backgrounds having kind of a better access to education, better access to higher education, and then they get themselves into top jobs, and then they get themselves into better incomes, and in that way they're going to become more wealthy. So I guess it would be kind of reasonable to maybe assume or guess that this like class origin wealth gap that's happened in this period has been met over the same period as the class origin income gap. But basically the answer to that is no, and we can see that here. So in the same period, the class origin income gap is actually remained quite stagnant. So there's nothing about like growing income inequalities by class origin that's kind of driving this kind of wealth inequality we're seeing. We also looked at this by education and looked at stuff like abilities to save per month by class origin, and nothing like that's changing either, really. Well, not changing enough, I guess, to explain the rising class origin wealth gap. So there's got to be something else going And I don't think it's surprising to say, and I think you probably all guessed that it's probably something to do with like inheritance and interleaver gifting and basically just like intergenerational family wealth. So, yeah, so if we start to break net wealth down by asset types, we start to get a bit of a clearer picture on what might be going on in terms of inheritance. So this table shows, again, class origin, and it shows kind of like asset ownership rates of different types of assets. We've got home ownership, investments, and savings. I'm going to focus in on home ownership for now because I feel like there's these major shifts in home ownership rates, which are probably explaining the like massive rise in class origin wealth gaps that we're seeing. So if we start at the very bottom and we look at the routine origin individuals, so class 7, the 1960s cohort, it's still the vast majority of these individuals who are homeowners by their late 30s. But then by the 1980s, that drops down to less than half of individuals born into those routine origins who are themselves like able to be homeowners by their late 30s. So what that means is for the 1960s cohort, there's a 16 percentage point difference in home ownership rates between those in the most advantaged background and the routine background, which then more than doubles to a 37 percentage point difference for the 1980s cohort. And clearly the thing is, people's homes are generally the greatest asset that they'll own, and it will make up the majority of an individual's gross wealth, if not net wealth as well. So any kind of like growing discrepancy that we see of home ownership rates by class origin are really going to drive class origin wealth gaps, and that's exactly what's happening today. So then if we look at home ownership rates by class origin, specifically here, we're just looking at the high managerial and routine origin individuals. If we look at that also by income quintile of these individuals, where 5 is the top income quintile and 1 is the lowest. What we see is that for the 1960s birth cohort, income rather than class background is the major driver of whether an individual can become a homeowner or not. But this is no longer really the case for the 1980s birth cohort. It seems a lot harder for those born into routine origins to become homeowners compared to the higher managerial origin individuals, even at similar incomes. And we can see for the higher managerial and professional origin individuals that they're very likely to be homeowners, even when they are themselves quite poorly paid. So class background is a much more important driver of home ownership today than it once was. And clearly the implication here is the rise in the power of Frank and Dad. So, yeah. So this question here was asked to the 1980s birth cohort, and it basically asked them if individuals got any help, financial help from family members when buying their home. So we see that 43% of individuals from the higher managerial professional origin stated that they were able to access financial wealth, where it's only like 8% from routine origins who were able to do this. It's kind of clear that those from less advantaged backgrounds are really kind of able to rely on the kind of education, income kind of mode and route into wealth, whereas those from more advantaged class backgrounds have a much wider range of channels open to them. And obviously these channels I'm talking about are like inheritance and family wealth. So we've mentioned that this kind of family wealth mode allows for routes into home ownership, but it's not the only way that parental wealth helps with wealth acquisition, as Sam was talking about. So for instance, firstly, obviously it can help in terms of basically giving you directly like inheritance and gifting. And then secondly, again, as Sam mentioned, parental wealth can help act as a kind of insurance for advantaged origin individuals, where they can feel more comfortable partaking in more risky activities, which can be potentially quite profitable. For instance, more risky investment choices. So I know we've only had a look at like home ownership today, but I have also looked at things like financial assets, and it's the same trend as kind of growing, but with investments over this period as well. Okay. So the conclusion is that there has been this like major growth in class origin wealth gaps over the last few generations. Home ownership rates have really been driving this growth, and as income becomes less important to home ownership and parental wealth becomes more important, intergenerational wealth transfers are becoming the key access driving issues of wealth mobility and wealth mobility stagnation today. So the implications here are kind of that when we traditionally think of to fix social mobility, we kind of traditionally think of like the democratization of education. We think about, getting people from less advantaged backgrounds into top jobs and top incomes. But this is likely not going to do that much to fix issues that we're seeing with economic mobility. We need to start thinking about inheritance-based solutions to address these issues. Yeah, and also just thinking more broadly about the implications of the rising power of inheritance today, it becomes quite concerning when we think about things like racial inequalities, for instance, and we'll hear a lot more about racial inequalities later on today, and the racial wealth divide. So yeah, basically there's a lot at stake for mobility as we move into a context where inheritance is becoming more key. Thanks.
Okay, we have, I should just say, fantastic empirical findings. Some of those are in this leaflet, so will you give them a copy? Pass out. Please pick up those, yeah. Okay, so this is really brand new, it's really new research, and change over time is really distinctive, so that's I think, really significant. But we have 10 minutes or so for questions or comments. Yeah.
Thank you so much, both of you, really interesting. I was just trying to connect something Andy talked about earlier, the sense of the unclaimed wealth in London particularly, and I was struck by how many of the wealthiest people work in finance, for instance, and sort of hearing you, Sam, first, and then the work on families. It just made me very curious about the relationship between all of this and place. And when we talk about inheritance tax, is there something also about place-based inheritance tax? If certain people are getting easier access to London, to footholds into London through gifting, and then they're in a market where the rewards from doing that early are enormous, that's quite different from, if you get help to buy a house in a sort of slightly more economically stagnant part of the country where the dividends from that might be less.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. I think it would obviously be probably quite contentious politically. But I think in terms of an evidence base, it's really clear, certainly when I think back, connecting some of the dots to the qualitative work I did in the class ceiling, quite how much flows from, in terms of your ability to pursue a career in all sorts of professions that are dominated by London, if you have this ability to make a life. And thinking a lot, so I did this big study in the civil service, and it's really interesting in the civil service because there's often these sort of bottlenecks, it's sort of mid-career. People working in the civil service outside of London, to progress, they need to move to London. They're usually sort of 30s, and that has to come in with a calculus around, can they bring up a family, for example, and obviously very soon after that, you start thinking about whether you can buy a home. And so many people telling me that they sort of selected out of that decision. And so I think you would have to, to get any policy traction, provide a really clear evidence base of how the reason why is that it's such a big gatekeeping sort of mechanism for all sorts of sort of career labour market outcomes. But yeah, I don't know. I think it would be contentious, but I think there is definitely some evidence that would support that type of thing.
Yes.
Hi, Will Snell from the Fairness Foundation. Really interesting research. To the extent that there's generally a sort of underappreciation in terms of public awareness of certain types of inequality, is your sense that there's more sort of inherent understanding of this increasing nature of this sort of inequality among the public at large? I'm just thinking about some of the, for example, the British Social Attitudes research from last year showing that class divides have become more kind of salient recently than they used to be. People seem to be more aware of the importance of class, and whether you think that there's something going on there or
not. So I think there's a couple of things maybe I'd say on that. I think certainly what I've noticed in the sort of 10, 12 years I've been working on this at an organizational level is that class has gone from being completely and utterly absent from any kind of D&I agenda, for example, to being something now that most big law firms in the UK, most professional service firms, media companies are now routinely talking about, measuring and thinking about. So I think there's a sense, there's still an uneasiness, right? And you see that in political discourse around class all the time, a kind of coming in and out of, you know, hardworking people, you know, and actually like foregrounding class. But I think it's probably, it's certainly, we're not in the same place we were in the mid-90s when there was a sort of strong sense that that entire sort of discourse was gone from how we thought in Britain. Just to say that, I mean, specifically on wealth, you know, I think one of the, you know, I sat on this social mobility commission, and it's interesting because I think what a lot of the evidence is suggesting, and that's what Mina's big takeaway from Mina's talk would be about the importance of kind of thinking about wealth for a social mobility agenda. The commission and the commissioners and the politicians, you know, who were responsive to the commission there was zero interest in connecting wealth to the social mobility agenda at that point. That was a few years ago, and maybe it'd be harder to ignore now. I think there's a real challenge in making that connection explicitly through various types of evidence to sort of start that conversation.
Yes, definitely Robbie found good answers to movement. I find that, thank you so much for the presentation. I found it incredibly anxiety inducing, actually, given the work that I do, my proximity to wealth holders and having been a private wealth lawyer for 10 years in the past. And a lot of the framing that supports our work is the idea of the great, well, it's not an idea, it's the great wealth transfer, which is the largest intergenerational wealth transfer in human history between baby boomers and millennials. And if we're already at this place with the data, I'm thinking about is there a plan to kind of take this data and kind of try and do some forecasting as to where we might end up as that wealth transfer happens over the next couple of decades, and to think about how then do you shape policy? Because if it's an enormous amount of wealth that's changing hands, typically at the point of death or in anticipation of death, we know that inheritance tax is generally like hated, like in terms of public opinion. And so thinking about the other forms of taxation that could apply, I'm not sure if I'm really asking the right question, but it's an opportunity that needs to be captured because it's the largest intergenerational wealth transfer in human history. And if we know that it's intergenerational wealth that's already causing these problems, where are we going to end up in 20 years' time?
I mean, just in terms of like, I haven't forecasted it. I haven't thought about forecasting, but I'm like, I get what you're saying about where we are at the generate. Like, if it's this bad now and with everything we know going on, how bad is it going to get? Like, I'm super desperate to be able to get my hands on the data for the 90s cohort, which are about 3 years out from understanding society giving us that data. So it's like, can't wait to do it when I can. But I mean, I've started looking at it because I mean, I do like waiting until that like 35, like that 35, 40 kind of cut off. And obviously with people in the 90s, or the oldest person is 94 just now. So I started looking at it kind of in late 20s. It's not great to look at. There are inequalities, but we also know that as you grow older, like class-based, like wealth inequalities get worse as you grow older for all of these different reasons, income consumption, parental wealth transfer coming a bit later. So no, not forecasted it. Would love to know as well. So it's something I'm definitely thinking about as well.
Time for a couple of questions. Yeah, sure.
Hi, my name's Priya and I'm from the Equality Trust. I just wanted to ask a question. One of the earlier slides was about British elite and how they kind of managed to retain their kind of elite status and pass that on to their children. But I just wondered if you had any, or had it, you know any kind of studies that tracks where that elite status and that original, or the origins of that money is from, and whether there's any kind of evidence of how much of it came from the kind of slavery economy, thinking about, reparations, and whether there's, whether what's happening in that kind of space, I would suppose.
Yeah, not something that we've done in our study specifically. this, I feel like there was a study of what just thinking off the top of my head, I feel like there are some.
We do have a paragraph in here.
Maybe the answer will come in but a few minutes' time.
Yeah, but it's absolutely right today.
Yeah.
Okay, right, yeah.
Well, I have one question, actually. When I look at these two slides, which are really quite dramatic, where the top class, background of the top class really matters for wealth, but does not matter for income. If you were to define wealth without housing, so if you were just to take financial wealth and stuff, then the things would change, I suppose.
Yeah.
So would actually housing explain the entire difference?
Housing explains most of it, definitely, and that's why, given the time we had, I decided to look at housing and ignore the financial assets I've really done. So it's definitely the vast majority of it. I mean, I guess rather than being about like the quantity of the difference, like financial assets investments, they're important for kind of more different reasons. I guess they're more like easily convertible, or it would be like liquid in the industry compared to other like advantages earlier on, I guess, in life. But yeah, no, you are right. It is mainly housing that's driving.
Let's move on. Thank you, Sam and Mina. So yeah, so that's it's really important. Class matters. Now look at gender, and then after the coffee break, race, and see how this picture stacks together and builds up. So we're gonna have one more session before the coffee break, and we're gonna have. Phew. So Liz has just completed her PhD in the Department of Social Policy, exploring questions around gender, household relationship, family and kinship, and wealth inequalities. And we'll be talking about some of our results now.
Thank you.
Sorry, after it's a bad moment to sneak out and get a glass of water. Or a good moment. So I'm going to talk about the gender wealth gap. Much of what I'm about to say is in the report, so feel free to relax. It's all there. You can have it with you. So I'll firstly go over a bit of background, and then I'll talk about highlights from the report before giving some reflections on why it mattered. So the gender wealth gap is wealth historically has commonly treated as a household statistic, characteristic, particularly in economic statistics. It's household information collected at household level. And data is only rarely collected at the individual level internationally. In fact, the UK Wealth and Asset Survey and the German Socio-Economic Panel are some of the only long-standing individualized data sources that have individual wealth data. And when you look at wealth at a household level, that means that individual characteristics, including gender, race, disability, and others, they become obscured by the data. And international evidence suggests that wealth is becoming increasingly individualized in its holding, meaning individual wealth holdings do matter. And my own research on the intra-household allocation of wealth demonstrates it cannot be assumed that wealth is shared fully or equally within the household. So, what do we know about the individual holdings of wealth? Men hold more wealth than women. Women are less likely to live in high wealth households than men. And the most recent ONS statistics say that on average, men hold £90,000 more wealth than women, a mean gender wealth gap of 25.8%. And when they control for other characteristics, their estimates expand this gap to over £100,000. In my research, I include business assets, and this expands the gap even further. So just looking at this by asset type, we can see that the real driver of the gender wealth divide is pensions. In fact, men's pension wealth outstripped women's by a massive £79,000. More bluntly, men's average pension wealth is close to twice that of women's. And this chasm in pension assets is likely a reflection of the cumulative impact of the gender pay gap, plus shorter hours and lower participation in the labour market. The implication is that many of the tax incentives and reliefs available on pension assets primarily benefit, say it quietly, rich white men. And we don't see a significant difference in property or physical assets, although the survey data is somewhat limited in this as it makes assumptions over where a house is shared jointly, it is also shared equally. So the data could be improved in that regard. And whilst pensions appear to be the key driver of the gender wealth divide, a smaller but statistically significant difference is also seen in net financial wealth and in business assets, where men's ownership is on average £13,000 and £12,000 more than women's respectively. So, the gender wealth gap is driven by the top of the distribution. If we look at the gender wealth gap across the wealth distribution, we observe that the mean gender wealth gap is driven by differences in the upper half of the wealth distribution. The median wealth gap is a more modest 10% or approximately £12,000. However, above the median, the gap widens and the differences become statistically significant. By the 75th percentile, the gap has widened to 21% or approximately £85,000. By the 90th percentile, the gap is 28% or a difference of £265,000. At the very pinnacle of the wealth distribution, men continue to dominate. Just 3 women appear in the Sunday Times rich list. Top 10, and even they appear alongside their partners or family. Undoubtedly, there are more women included under the more opaque banner of and family. For example, I don't know if my pronunciation is going to be very good on this, but our richest man, Gopi Hinduja, is married. His wife is, however, is not named in the list, and nor are David or Simon Reuben's wives. And this lack of visibility is in itself symbolic. These are the world's richest men, and their wives are barely acknowledged. It also speaks to perceptions of who really owns the money. When Jeff Bezos got divorced, it was widely reported about the impact on his wealth. So does it matter that there's such a yawning divide? And now I'm going to run through a few reasons to care about the gender wealth gap. And if I can find it, I'm going to find the right page. So, firstly, the gender wealth gap unveils the accumulated economic disadvantage of women. The gender pay gap is the more common measure of economic inequality faced by women, but this offers only a snapshot of the economic disadvantage women face. For it only captures the inequality in the hourly pay of full and part-time employees and does not reflect differences in hours worked or take into account those not currently engaged in paid work or in self-employment. Furthermore, the gender pay gap does not reveal the long-term and cumulative effect of women's earnings disadvantage. Remembering the gap widens when controlling for other characteristics. In contrast, the gender wealth gap has the potential to unveil the accumulated economic disadvantage women face, yet this receives only limited research and policy attention. The gender wealth gap, therefore, deserves greater research and policy attention than it currently receives. And if that alone doesn't persuade you, then perhaps we can think about it as a poor omen for the future. So the gender wealth gap highlights the gender pension gap. And women, as I've said, have substantially smaller private pensions wealth than men. And this will likely result in lower personal income in retirement and potentially poorer living standards in older age. And it's not reasonable to assume that households will share their pension income. They may not even be living in the same household in old age as they do now. Many more people are choosing to cohabit, and many more people are deciding to have children outside of marriage. And many women in those instances may not have access to the same rights as they would do if they were married, in terms of what would happen if they were to separate or divorce. So this further suggests that the HMRC's estimated £48.3 billion annual net cost of income tax and NIC reliefs on pensions contributions and investments incomes majorly benefits men. And this likely reflects the accumulated disadvantage in the labour market, but further highlights a potential future gender gap of women's retirement income. And again, if that's not enough to persuade you, then we might start to think about financial and subjective well-being. So the international evidence from the UK, France and Italy suggests that wealth is becoming increasingly individualised, and personal wealth is more closely associated with men's and women's subjective well-being than their spouse's wealth. And these findings are in accord with the income sharing literature, where women value financial independence and autonomy, and having their own income is very important for women's self-esteem. So, are there any more reasons to be concerned? Well, there's a potential double penalty for those with intersecting protected characteristics. So as my colleague Eleni will later present the findings on the racial wealth divide, potentially women of colour and those with intersecting protected characteristics may experience a double penalty, and this is currently under research. And the evidence we put forward regarding pensions are echoed in other areas, so tax incentives for ISAs and other capital incentive programs disproportionately benefit men. And French evidence further highlights systematically gender divorced and inheritance practices which serve to disadvantage women's wealth accumulation, and those patterns that we don't fully understand here in the UK, but may well work in similar ways. And in our report, we further reflect on the impact of wealth inequality on the democratic process. And here it's worth noting that women are underrepresented in both houses of Parliament, representing just 35% of MPs and 29% of peers. So there's widespread acknowledgement of the disproportional political influence of the rich. Does it matter if the rich are also disproportionately male? Yet the gender wealth gap and its potential causes receives little research attention in the UK, and much more could and should be done to consider and address this important issue. So I just offer some concluding thoughts, and those are that there is a substantial gender wealth divide, and this likely reflects accumulated economic disadvantages faced by women. The pensions wealth gap is particularly stark and raises the question of who benefits from tax reliefs on pensions and capital gains. Distributional analysis and by protected characteristic would be reviewed in this regard, and I think it's really important that we do more to reflect on both the gender wealth gap and its potential mechanisms that create it. And policy contributes to the scale of this gap. Like, it doesn't need to be this way. And obviously the gender wealth gap varies by country. So the socio-economic and policy context are important for this. So in summary, the gender wealth gap warrants further research and policy attention than we're currently giving.
So you've got 10 minutes or so for questions and reflections. Yeah, Victoria.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very interesting research again. I was curious if you have any idea of to what extent is it driven by someone being a woman versus being a mother? Like, is there research comparing childless or child-free women versus mothers? Like, you know, does it a lot have to do with like going part-time, taking time out to care for children, etc.?
There is research in the German context that suggests that there is a motherhood penalty associated with the gender wealth gap. I would say that it's highly likely that we would see something similar in the UK, and obviously the way in which British families are encouraged by policy for the woman to end up taking an extended period of break from work and the consequential effects on her career, I would guess leads to more gap in the gender wealth gap than you would necessarily see in the income equivalent earning statistics. But that research hasn't been done for the UK.
Yeah. Ian Mulhern from Resolution Foundation. Thanks for this really interesting work. On the pensions bit, a conclusion that you drew, I'd be really interested to know what you think about the kind of prospects for that, because I think from my sort of reading the pensions data in the Wealth and Assets Survey, you know, a lot of it comes from DB pensions for very much older workers and people already in retirement, and that is obviously a kind of a sort of form of pension that's basically disappearing now and doesn't really exist for sort of the under 50s anymore. So that might suggest that this is a form of inequality that might be on the way out. I don't know whether you looked into that or looked at that sort of potential cohort effect.
I haven't gone into the detail of what's defined benefit and defined contribution. I would be interested to have a look, but my sense is that defined benefit pensions aren't always valued. They use the sort of generic government methodology to estimate the value of those pensions. Doesn't necessarily always reflect how valuable they actually are. So whilst I do think that they could contribute to this, I don't think it's the sole explanation for why we see such a large pension gap. And whilst we do see a larger wealth gap in older age, it's hard to say whether or not that's driven by cohort effect or life experience accumulated disadvantage. So those two areas where I suggest we do a bit more research.
Hi, I'm Inasa from the Women's Project Groups, and thank you so much for your presentation. You mentioned that you look at the intra-household allocation of wealth, and I would like to know if you can tell us a bit more about that, especially for those like shared or joint assets, but we don't know how are they like distributed.
Yeah, so I can say a huge amount about that. I've got 3 chapters on my thesis that qualitatively explore the intra-household allocation of wealth. And I also look at this quantitatively within the Wealth and Assets Survey, within what was the predecessor to this work that's gone into the report. So what I would say about the intra-household allocation of wealth is that there is still a big divide between what's held individually by spouses, but vis-a-vis those that live with a cohabiting partner, for instance. And my qualitative research suggests that we certainly cannot presume that women are comfortable in sharing, particularly pension income assets in the long term. And what I would say about the sort of intra-household allocation is that people are very aware of where the assets came from. So even if it is shared, it's not shared fully or equally, and that they don't have equal access to enjoyment. And I can speak a lot more about that, and perhaps I can refer you to movies.
I'm wondering if I could actually pick up just on that, because the evidence about pensions, that makes a lot of sense. But I was wondering in some of those other wealth, asset categories where it looks like, there isn't such a big gender gap. I wonder whether your research, qualitative or quantitative, says something about the amount of access that women have within a household to, say, make financial decisions like remortgaging a house in order to get some ready cash, making those kinds of decisions where they can access some of that wealth and use it. Do you find a gap there?
Yeah, so this is something that's been a subject of both the income sharing literature for quite a long time, like who has the final say in financial decision making. My own experience of that in my research is that everyone wants to claim that they have dual and equal decision making, and yet as the sort of narrative proceeds, it becomes clear that they don't have equal access, and particularly mothers. So one of the points I make in one of my qualitative papers is that sort of having children comes as sort of an economic shock to the family, and one that people are sort of completely unprepared for, which some of my friends have raised an eyebrow at, usually those that don't have children. Because, how can you not be prepared? And my comparison for that is, well, a new parent knows that having a baby means sleep deprivation, but you don't really know what that means until you have the baby. And then you experience sleep deprivation. So I would say the same in terms of sort of the financial impact. Having a child is going to have a financial impact. And yet, when that happens, it makes a radical impact on the family finances and who that impacts. And more often than not, it sort of adversely impacts the woman more than the man. And in some cases, in ways that the male partner doesn't fully appreciate or understand, because some of it's psychological. There are, and this echoes the income sharing literature, there are psychological barriers to feeling fully entitled to use someone else's money. So there's definitely more to go on. And again, I can refer you back to my thesis stage.
I'll just ask one question. If you refer to that's really important book, LSE and Gola, gender and capital is kind of a bit complicated. But one of the points they make is the key thing, one of the key drivers of gender wealth was what happens when you make and the situation. And the point they make in the French context is that a lot of the time, whatever the law might say at one level, the mentories go into the view that the business should be preserved, and therefore keep its own entity together, which not really is proportionate, and that tends to be the man in the inheritor keeps that business. One of the implications of that argument that it may not apply so much in the UK, we have a different legal system, we have mentories and all that, I don't know, but what be interesting from you on that, but also going back to our discussion about what's happening at the top end. Think about the example of Bezos, which you gave, and all that. When you're getting these really high-powered businesses, and the strong, demands from corporate interests to keep the business together, that might again accentuate the gender gap at the top of these forces.
Yeah, no, I'm fascinated by LSE and Golak's findings, and I would really like to look into the extent to which we can apply them in the UK. I think there are some suggestions that we could have similar but maybe not the same issues. I've been quietly following a inheritance dispute down in the south coast between a rich family where the farm wants to be preserved. And so they valued the farm at a certain value to be able to keep it in for the man in an entirety, so the male sibling. And the sisters have challenged this in court. So I think there are ways in which our legal system may further support or hinder women's accumulation, particularly at divorce and inheritance. So it'd be really interesting to see that study emulated in the UK, postdoc maybe. And in terms of, what was your second question?
Just about as we get more then big businesses, you know, where that logic or terms of accentuate the gender divide.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of ways in which men are often socialized into taking on these big businesses and becoming involved in them in ways that, you know, potentially daughters are not. You know, I think Sam's no longer in the room, but thinking a bit about him and Aaron's work, you know, who goes to these elite schools. Well, all those elite schools are predominantly male. And therefore, who gets the jobs and who works in the finance industry, or the finance industry is predominantly male. You know, and I've been criticised for this work for not considering what's explained and what's not explained in terms of, you know, socialising into different industries by gender. But I think there's also a case that, you know, even why are some industries paid less than others is potentially gendered. You know, and we shouldn't just go, well, women are choosing these lower paid careers, so it's fine. Perhaps that, you know, we should consider that to be problematic as well.
Okay, thanks, Liz. So we have quarter of an hour for break. Please pick up the report outside and have a cup of tea. See you back here promptly at 4 o'clock for part 2. Thank you. Okay, we should begin to make a start. So now we're moving on to the second part of the expert roundtable. We've discussed class and sexual ability, we've discussed gender, and now we're going to be talking about race. With the racial wealth divide, I'm really pleased to welcome Eleni Karagiannaki. Eleni is an economist, assistant professor, research fellow at the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion case of the LSE. She's already been mentioned as one of the leading authorities on wealth inequality in the UK. Recently has focused a great deal on issues of racial inequality.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming and to this important event. As Mike said, today I'm going to talk about the racial wealth divide, racial and ethnic wealth divide, actually. And I suppose there is little disagreement that the racial wealth divide is one of the most evident facets of systemic inequalities in the UK society, which is rooted in historical, social, economic, and political inequalities. So, given its historical and systemic nature, it is also clear that its solutions, the solutions to closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap, are not as easy to be undertaken. And also it is clear that in order to start addressing the racial and ethnic inequalities, we need a better understanding of the scale, drivers, and the consequences of ethnic and racial wealth inequalities. So in today's presentation, I'm going to present some empirical evidence on the racial and ethnic wealth gap I'm going to present evidence on the scale and the drivers of the wealth gap between various racial and ethnic groups in the UK compared to the white British ethnic group. And I'm going also to present some evidence on some recent changes in the racial and ethnic wealth gap. The evidence I'm going to present is drawn from a piece of research that I have undertaken a year ago and published last summer, I think, and which was funded by the International Inequalities Institute. The evidence on the changes is part of another small supplementary work that I undertook with the support of the Stickert. So before I start and come to the actual results, it's crucial to mention, I mean, it's important to mention that the definition of wealth that I'm using here includes the sum of total financial and housing assets of the households, plus minus the total value of outstanding mortgage debt and total financial debt holdings. So it does not include pension wealth or business wealth. To mention that I'm using data from Understanding Society Wave 8, which provides wealth data for the year 2016-2018. So this graph shows the wealth holdings of different ethnic and racial ethnic groups at the median. What is immediately evident here is that the wealth holdings of most ethnic minority groups are substantially lower than that of the white British ethnic group. So the only group that has slightly higher wealth holdings than the white British ethnic group is the Indian. All the other groups are, their wealth is substantially lower, with the white other and the Asian other ethnic groups have wealth almost 2 times lower than that of the white British ethnic group, the Pakistani 3 times lower, and the Black Caribbean staggering 70 times lower than the white British. And the Bangladeshi and the Black African ethnic groups are the most disadvantaged ethnic groups with no wealth at all at the median. So this graph extends the picture and shows what's happening at other parts of the wealth distribution. So it shows here the picture at the median, which we saw before, and also shows the wealth levels at the 10th percentile and the 90th percentile. So we see first that as we move at the 90th percentile, all ethnic groups have higher wealth holdings compared to the median. But what is also very clear that even at the 90th percentile, the wealth holdings of ethnic minorities, most ethnic minority groups, are substantially lower than the white British and the Indian ethnic group. Also, when we move at the lower part of the distribution, we see, first of all, that all ethnic groups have a negative net worth, which means that their debt, total debt, is higher than their total the value of their asset, housing and financial assets. But it's clear again that the ethnic minority groups have substantially more net debt than the white majority. So the Black African and the Black Caribbean, Black African and the Asian other and the Bangladesh are the groups with the highest net debt holdings of the magnitude of more than £20,000, while the white British, it's not evident in this graph because of the scale of the, but have just, not just, but they have net debt of the magnitude of £1,400. So, as was mentioned earlier in another presentation as well, is that one of the reasons why ethnic minority groups have lower wealth than the white British, for example, the Indian, is that they have a much lower likelihood to own high return assets like investment and homes, especially for homes in the UK. The difference is striking, which is particularly important given that housing wealth accumulation, passive housing wealth accumulation due to very high home price growth, house price growth, was the main driver of wealth accumulation in the British society. So we see that the Indian, which is the highest, the group with the highest wealth holdings, have the highest home ownership rate at 73%, and the white British have a 69% home ownership rate. By comparison, the Black African ethnic group have a home ownership rate of 90%, which is more than three times higher than the white British and the Indians. Also, another reason why ethnic minority groups are more likely to have lower wealth holdings is that they are more likely to hold financial debt. So we see here that the Bangladeshi, Black Caribbean and Black African have around 70% probability of owning financial debt. And although financial debt may not be always bad, can actually help to accumulate wealth if invested well. The problem is that ethnic minorities and racial groups are more likely to hold high-cost liabilities like credit card debt and overdrafts, which is particularly problematic. So this slide shows the contribution of net financial and net housing wealth in explaining the gap in wealth of different ethnic minority groups and different parts of the distribution. What we can take from this graph is that financial wealth and actually financial debt, net financial debt, is the main contributor of the wealth gap at the lower part of the distribution, financial wealth at the upper part of the distribution, while at the middle, it is housing wealth that drive difference in the wealth gap. They drive the wealth gap between ethnic minority groups and the white British. So, yes, it is housing where and also for the Indian ethnic group, it is difference in the housing wealth that is the main contributor throughout the distribution, except for the very low part of the differences, the higher wealth holdings of the Indian ethnic group. So in the paper also, I examined the extent to which demographic differences and difference in income and socioeconomic status explain the ethnic gap between for different ethnic groups and whether their effect varies across the distribution. The results of this analysis showed that the Indian wealth advantage relative to the white British is fully explained by difference in the characteristics, mainly as a result of income difference, age, and household composition, while difference in characteristics difference in characteristics also explain a large share of the wealth disadvantage of the Bangladeshi, Black African, and Pakistani ethnic groups relative to the white Britons, but this effect is only evident at the lower part of the distribution. At the middle and the top of the wealth distribution, where ethnic difference in wealth are not explained by the characteristics. But the fact that the characteristics explain the wealth disadvantage at the lower part of the distribution is particularly important because it signifies the fact that it is not that ethnic minority groups have a different propensity to save or accumulate debt compared to the white Britons. It is their characteristics, it's particular characteristics that drive, they have particular characteristics that drive these lower wealth holdings. So then another important issue to examine when one examines the ethnic and racial wealth gap is how it changes over time, because the implications are very different if we see a widening or a narrowing of the wealth gap. So in a analysis that I have undertaken back in autumn, I examined how the wealth of different ethnic groups changed between 2012-14 and 2016-18. What this and how this changed at different parts of the distribution. What this analysis showed is that for most ethnic minority groups, the wealth gap relative to the white British majority increased at most part of the distribution, and especially the lower part, either because the wealth holdings of ethnic minority groups decreased or because they increased by less than, in pound terms, less than the wealth of the white British. The only group for whom whose wealth increased more than the white British is the Indian ethnic group, and it is actually during this period that the wealth of the Indian ethnic group overtook the white British wealth. So the next question that comes naturally to mind is, because the last point that I show you evidence for is in 2016-18, is how the ethnic wealth gap changed since then. Unfortunately, I don't have a definite answer for this question, but this is the focus of ongoing analysis that I'm undertaking as part of a new project that is funded by the British Academy and undertaking in partnership with the Equality Trust. We have a representative from the Equality Trust here. And so I've done some preliminary analysis, but it is a bit very much, work in progress. So there is some, I'm not 100% sure if it's, but the analysis showed that a further widening of the ethnic racial wealth gap between 2016-18 and 2022 which was mainly as the result of asset price growth benefiting against the already richer household, which and here are many, I mean, the white British, and a divergence in the homeownership rate and debt accumulation patterns of different ethnic groups. So the difficult question, can the ethnic wealth gap can be bridged, and how? I'm going to leave this question to be answered by you. But there are some stylized facts that point to the fact that probably this is a difficult task. It is, not probably, it is a difficult task. We know first that wealth, as Mike said at the beginning, is wealth represents the stock of resources accumulated over the past, and thus encompasses past decisions and historical inequalities and its advantage. Given this, its nature, eliminate it probably is a very difficult, but reducing it is probably something that can be done. But to reduce it, it requires a range of actions on many fronts, including continuing closing the labor market and earning gaps, reducing the gaps in homeownership, as well as implementing policies that boost savings and pension wealth, especially targeted to disadvantaged groups, addressing barriers to social housing access, as well as discrimination in the rental and mortgage market. So, that's it.
Thanks so much, Eleni. Wonderful and very important work. And the analysis of change over time is pretty new, and it's as we saw with class, it's also going to get worse. So it seems. Okay, we have 10 minutes or so for comments. Yeah, Paul.
So, one of the key political issues that's going to be coming up, it's clearly emerging, is what any incoming Labour government does about the right to buy. So I just wondered, what reflections do you think your research might have on that key housing policy debate, given that you're arguing that there should be a reduction in ethnic gaps and ownership, but also saying you want to address barriers to social housing. So I just wondered, could you reflect on that key policy debate?
Okay, I mean, it's on the one hand, I can say that many ethnic minority groups are overrepresented in the social housing sector, but most recent immigrants are not, I mean, are excluded from the social housing sector. So depends. Please.
The policy debate is about the right to buy.
Yes.
As to whether that should be maintained or it should be some way clawed back, eradicated. So I just wondered what your research says about that key debate.
Well, I mean, I guess so. I mean, we haven't done that work. I mean, presumably, is the issue you're posing that people in social housing would benefit by in terms of acute that will get closed off?
Exactly the issue.
Yeah,
is for all kinds of reasons. Housing policy, people are saying that the right to buy is a real problem.
So, Shabnam, I mean, you studied, didn't you, Bangladeshi?
I've thought about this in my work. So lots of the people that I interviewed for my PhD going back a few years, I think we've had this conversation previously, took advantage of the right to buy as a way to get into the property ladder. But then subsequently, their children are now suffering the consequences of that one-off benefit because they are now not able to live in the local community and are having to move out of Tower Hamlets, which is where I studied. So I think there is a real tension there, both between the right to buy as a way to enable minority ethnic groups who are not necessarily going to be able to buy on the open market as a way in which to get onto the property ladder. But then that also reduces, obviously, the wider social housing stock. I would argue that the broader argument is here the building more social housing, obviously. So I think that kind of bypasses that. But yeah, there is a fundamental tension there.
Yes.
No, thank you.
Great. Any more questions, thoughts?
Thank you. Thank you for that. I was just thinking about in relation to the previous presentations we heard about social mobility and how important it is to kind of think generationally about some of these issues. And there are aspects of your presentation, I noticed that sort of spoke to that around, you know, the points in time when different groups arrived in the country. You know, I know that certainly from the Indian background point of view, there's at least a folk memory that in order to escape discrimination in the labour market, many Indians sort of went into private enterprise, so that they were able to build wealth and so on. And yeah, I just sort of, what am I asking? If I think about some of these policies that you sort of set out in actions, where is there kind of like any room for hope? You know, often ethnic minority families arrive in the country because they're trying to build a better future, and you know, there is the need to kind of build up a base over time, and kind of based on what we might be sort of seeing from sort of more recent waves of migration, where through the points-based system, people are coming in to do higher skilled or higher paid jobs and so on, and that's from a range of ethnicities. Would we expect to see any of these curves to change?
I think that without policy intervention, not very easily, because it's the issue that wealth now, the major driver of wealth accumulation is having wealth. So income is becoming less and less important in the wealth accumulation. So without no intervention, somehow it's quite difficult to achieve this.
Yeah.
Hi, Christopher from JW Berlin. So you showed that some of the differences are explained by compositional differences in, let's say, sociodemographic profiles, but then there's some unobserved effects of what would explain this. I would like to hear if you have any reflections about what are these unobserved differences that might be playing a role, because the usual suspect would be some sort of taste-based discrimination, right? But then it's really interesting to understand this relative advantage of the Indian compared to other ethnicities.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, this unobserved factor is can encompass a lot of things. I mean, it's the immigration history that you mentioned before, when the people arrived, where they arrived, their home background as well. It's not only discrimination as such. It is part of the reason, but it's not only that. Past labor market discrimination, it can encompass quite a lot of things, actually. Even
just on that, are you controlling for geography? Because I can imagine one of the big migrant flows was to the kind of declining industries of the North of England.
Yeah.
And migrant groups who went to Oldham and Rochdale, they weren't benefited so much from house price inflation. So I'd imagine those kind of geographic effects
yeah.
also play. Yeah. Two questions, yeah. First from you and then Shabba, yeah.
Comment really, so it ties into, I think, Mina's presentation earlier. One of the things in the housing market that's changed over the last 15 or so years is the massive increase in the proportion of deposit that people have to have because of changes in the mortgage market. So one of the reasons I think, really, why you're saying, one of the ways you get wealth is by having wealth, that dynamic has been made worse by changes in the mortgage market, which have meant that even if house prices had stayed where they were, only better off people, or people with the means to inherit or have gifts, would be able to get on the housing ladder. And so I think in all of these dimensions, ethnicity and in income, those changes are worth thinking about, because I think they are behind some of the, at least the housing part of wealth growing.
Comment perhaps? Yeah.
I was just going to make a comment, really with respect to our colleagues' comment over there as well, about where you're presenting the data around Indian versus the Bangladeshi and Pakistani, and this came up in a presentation and a conversation before again as well. Do you think there's a risk of speaking to the kind of deficit model explanations that Bangladeshi, Pakistani families and households are culturally deficient, make different choices, and that is the explanation? Because I think last time when I was in a conversation like this, there was a question from the floor about how we can't use explanations around structural racism when you've got this kind of difference. And I wonder if there's a way to kind of be able to talk about these kind of outcomes in a way that explains some of that more actively in terms of migration histories, but also speaking to the presentation before about class origins of some of the migrants as well, and how that provides some inspiration to some of the racism that other groups might experience and so on. Because I think that there is often a risk, and from our perspective, the kind of bold facts as they're presented there can be used in a really regressive way to kind of challenge arguments that actually we need more kind of racial justice policies. We need to think about these things from a racial justice perspective.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's difficult to communicate these things, but the fact that there are so stark inequalities also between the Indian ethnic minority group is, is another facet of inequalities that also may be brought from home to your destination home. So it is difficult to communicate. The fact that demographic, socioeconomic differences, better education among the Indian ethnic groups explains the ethnic wealth advantage is something that can be, stressed further.
Okay, we should move on. Thank you very much, Eleni. Okay, so we've explored the significance of wealth divides across three axes, very powerful and increasing in many axes. And so we're now going to slightly change tack, but in a really way which is really complementary. Sacha Hilhorst just finished her PhD in the Department of Sociology. She's done this fantastic, this is going to be qualitative research, ethnographic research from two working class towns. And the issue here is, what does life feel like amongst communities who lack wealth? And this is going to be a great presentation, Sacha.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you very much to the organisers for this great event. And part of the thinking behind this today is that when we talk about wealth inequality and the politics of wealth inequality, we often talk about the super rich, right? And we've got great research about that. And it also corresponds to my experience of being in London, where some of this is so visible, right? I'm a cyclist, I get everywhere on my bike, and so sometimes you'll suddenly find yourself in these pockets of immense wealth, right? These huge mansions, the shiny towers, the sovereign wealth fund owned infrastructures, often in quite close geographic proximity to pockets of real deprivation in places where children grow up in striking poverty. And so that way, London almost offers like a mental map of what inequality can look like. And that's not true in the same way for large swathes of the country, where there is not only less wealth overall, but also there's not as much wealth nearby. And people's images of wealth are also quite different, playing into a different sort of politics. I think understanding those areas is going to be hugely important as we try to forge these coalitions that tackle issues around wealth inequality, because we know that public concern around these issues hasn't kept pace with the reality of sort of intensifying wealth inequality. And so understanding the politics of this across the country is going to be hugely important, I think, for coalition building and crafting messages going forward. I come at this from a very particular perspective, which is Mansfield in Nottinghamshire, which is one of the locations where I did my fieldwork, my ethnographic work, where I spoke to people about their lives and their relation to politics and lots of themes. And ideas of inequality and also wealth inequality came through in all sorts of different ways. And for context, Mansfield was predominantly a mining town. It also had a really strong textiles industry and engineering, which has very much been lost in the past few decades. Some of it very recently. The last local pit closed in 2015, so that's astonishingly recent. In terms of wealth, there's quite a lot of people locally who own a little bit of wealth in the form of their home, which really dominated a lot of these conversations. Also, lots of people own basically no wealth at all, including many of the labor migrants who work in care homes and distribution centers locally that have taken the place of the mines. And then there's one person who commutes by helicopter, more on whom later. And yes, I want to show you a little bit of how this plays out in the politics of it. And Mansfield's an interesting place to think about this politically. If you're not from the region, there's basically two reasons why you might have an image of Mansfield, two moments when it really sort of dominated national conversations. One of those was the miners' strike 40 years ago now, when Nottinghamshire miners were infamous for working through the strike. The other moment was Brexit, when Mansfield voted to leave by a huge margin. Over 70% voted leave, people who passed their vote. And both of these are actually to do with wealth as well in ways that are underappreciated. And so I want to start sort of slightly unusually in that moment 40 years back, when all those miners chose to keep working during the strike. And for a bunch of arcane reasons that I won't bore you with, home ownership patterns were really very different in Mansfield compared to other coal fields. The Nottinghamshire coalfield is hugely productive, and keeping it operational was a huge part of why Thatcher was able to, quash the mining unions. And the key factor here, and speaking to ex-miners now, this is what they will mention, that people were going to lose their homes. And a big part of that was the fact that they were not in council homes, they were not tenants. They were private homeowners, which was the result of specific policies in the 1970s, which meant that in large parts of Scotland and Wales, basically 3/4 of people in these mining areas are in council homes. And what these councils, which were sort of invariably Labour dominated, did during the strike is they deferred rents. Because they said, well, you have to live, and we're in support of this strike, so don't worry about it. You can stay in your home, you're good. And this was a huge form of solidarity, of course, which sort of bolstered people's support in this key political moment. In Mansfield, the ratio was reversed. 3/4 were homeowners, they were owner-occupiers, and they experienced no such solidarity from their mortgage providers, right? And so it made the politics of this really acute. And this is one of the ways that the politics of wealth and wealth inequality can play out, where people have got a small foothold in wealth, in what is otherwise a pretty hostile terrain. And it can inspire particular conservatism, and it can put these solidarities under real pressure. This was from a funeral I attended with miners who did strike. I don't know if you can see, but the banner says, "So few, so strong." And these things very much are very alive locally still. When I attended the funeral, one of the miners there told me that he has a plot and an allotment nearby, and the striking and non-striking miners still dig up each other's onions to sabotage each other's vegetable yields. In retrospect, that moment in the 70s and 80s were actually quite an unusual time, in the sense that work could genuinely get you a chunk of asset. Especially if you were a white male industrial worker and you were willing to go down the pit, which was dangerous and quite horrible work, then there was a real chance of you owning a home, getting a good pension, having a stake. And that is not true in Mansfield today. It's now a social mobility cold spot, one of the worst in the country, where if you are a child growing up in a lower income household in Mansfield, your chances of escaping that are much more limited than elsewhere. And this, for many, was experienced as a real sort of breaking of a social contract. There was still a deep sense that hard work ought to give you a chunk, not just of income, but of an asset, of something that would persist over time, something that would give you security in an unsure world. This is what we have in Mansfield now. This was built while I was in the field, and it makes it very sort of striking, right? Quite often these warehouses are built on top of old pits. This is quite near one of the pits to the south of Mansfield. To the north of Mansfield, you've got Shirebrook, which was one of the pits, which is now a Sports Direct warehouse, refurbished with, I think, £37 million in state support to become a massive, massive warehouse. I've got a few vignettes. I know this font is tiny, so my apologies. But basically, this is from me spending time in these pubs with ex-miners and them talking about home ownership, amongst other things. And in these snippets, you'll see the politics of income and wealth and sort of markers of class more broadly as well, sort of intermingle. But particularly the fact that home ownership is not an option for the younger generation feeds into a sense of declinism, even for people who were sort of on the right side of it. Like these guys, they own their homes, right? You'll see one of them says, like, at 18, I got my own house. At 24, I had paid for it. That is unimaginable to me now. And admittedly, I didn't have to go down a mine shaft at age 16. So, you know, there's upsides and downsides. But these men felt so cynical about politics. So they were talking constantly about how politics was corrupt. This was one of their favorite things to talk about. They were exchanging anecdotes about all the misdeeds of politicians and of their MP. And a big part of it was this sense that there was no realistic prospect for the younger generation to have what they had. There's a big political science literature as well about what declinism does to people's politics. And the politics of wealth inequality was a big part of that. Another part of the politics of it is a sense that politicians are from a different world. They're wealthy, they're on high incomes, and they're not like us at all. I'll give you a second to have a look at this. And for me, part of what's so evocative about this is some of the themes that came through very strongly in basically all my, or not all, no, it's never all, but very many of my interviews. It's the sense that politicians are on a different planet, or they're from a different world. They don't live in the same country as us. These metaphors came up repeatedly to say that politicians just don't understand. And people would say with some pride also that politicians just couldn't do it. They would say, you tried to put them in my shoes and they couldn't last a day. What, taking care of, you know, my disabled child, dealing with my crappy landlord, trying to work a 0 hours contract. They just couldn't manage. They couldn't swing it. And this was both about the sense that politicians were on high incomes, but it was also the sense that politicians were wealthy people. People would talk about how many homes Tony Blair owned, And again, homeownership sort of is a flashpoint here. I remember talking to sort of one of them, one of the more cynical interviewees that I spent a lot of time with. And I remember asking him, like, so do you think it's really corrupt in the sense of like they're taking backhanders? And he said, of course they are. How many houses has Tony Blair got? He didn't get that type of wealth in the prime minister's salary. I'll tell you that. And so these inequalities in wealth were a flashpoint for various forms of political discontent. In interesting ways would feed into an anti-politics and political cynicism, as well as for many a sense that change wasn't really possible because politics was just not for the likes of them. And we know that political participation is increasingly stratified by asset ownership. We can see that in the data where patterns of voting and non-voting are increasingly shaped by your position in sort of these hierarchies of wealth. In some cases, this led to sort of outright conspiracy theories, as we'll see here. Again, we have quantitative evidence that suggests that inequality is related to support for conspiracy theories, both at a country level and in experimental settings. And that comes through quite strongly in my interviews as well. As you can tell, these interviews during the sort of the latter part of the pandemic. And there's a sense that, you know, the rich are getting richer. It's getting harder for the rest of us. Somebody's making money off of all this. And it plays into a very real sense that, that life is hard. And for some people, it doesn't seem to be hard. And how do we reconcile that? There's an obvious tension here as well with studies based on sort of focus group type settings, where if you ask people about wealth and the taxing of wealth, they're often quite reluctant, right? And they say, well, I don't want to bash the rich. There's a deep faith in meritocracy and quite a lot of reluctance to go after people's wealth. And this exists the tension with the world that my interviewees are very much sketching, right? Which is an unfair world in which their children are having an incredibly hard time, in which it's all too easy for some people who want to keep you under the thumb, as Martin put it in the previous slide. And some of that is reconciled, or at least becomes clear when you talk about salient local examples. So when talking about the rich in general, there was a sense that many people had sort of worked hard for it, that they deserved it, that maybe they created jobs and opportunities. Quite saliently, Mansfield Town FC, the local football team, just won promotion into League One of the English football pyramid, thanks to a cash injection by its multi-millionaire owner, which is, you know, quite good for the image of the very rich locally at the moment. On the other hand, you've got somebody like Sports Direct owner Mike Ashley, the man who used to commute in by helicopter. His company built a massive warehouse just north of Mansfield in the old pit, where people are employed under terrible conditions. And he was very much seen as a bad guy and an example of just how shameless the rich can be. And that was very much to do with his politics of work, which was hugely important. The sense that he wasn't offering good jobs, he wasn't offering real jobs. He wasn't willing to invest in the community, he was just taking things from it. And so this politics of wealth and sort of and challenging it ends up being quite finely tuned, quite sort of almost case by case. And there's a strong sense that there's the good wealthy and the bad wealthy, and people make quite sharp distinctions, which exists alongside a declinism and anti-politics, and a sense that the country is often worse for the fact of inequality, and that some type of social contract has been broken. Because there is also a deep faith and a deep belief that work ought to pay, and that hard work is sort of ennobling in some way, even though hard work doesn't get you terribly much in Mansfield anymore. In terms of what this means for politics, I think there's notes of hope in terms of, how we might craft messages and how we might speak to these concerns. For a long time, a lot of Mansfield and sort of the region around it was quite unusual in that people were much more likely to vote for Labour than you would expect on the basis of demographics like ethnicity, age, home ownership. Another crisis point really changed that, and that was Brexit, which really amplified a process, a move away from the Labour Party that had been happening for some time. And again, from quantitative data, we can see that areas which have high home ownership, but stagnating house prices were amongst the very most likely to vote Brexit. And the Leave campaign here managed to draw on all those things that I've mentioned, the declinism, so the sense that things were getting worse over time, the anti-politics, so the skepticism of political elites, the importance of work, and even sort of the corruption talk all fed into it. But they don't have to be conservative or regressive messages. Like there are also forms of solidarity and almost a sort of working class universalism at play, where people really have an immense belief in the importance of work over wealth and lived experience of what inequality can look like. Which brings me back to this case that I always think about, which was a teacher who lived next to one of the old pits on the north side of Mansfield. And he said he used to always hear the winding gear that would move people up and down. And that sound was constant. It was just a part of the landscape for a very long time. And the day that the mine shut, suddenly it fell silent. And that was hugely evocative for him. And more recently, there was a change in what the sonic landscape looked like. And it was Mike Ashley's helicopter buzzing overhead as he commuted to his Sports Direct warehouse. So all that is to say that the politics of wealth inequality outside of some of our glistening cities is complex, but there's huge opportunities as well for crafting messages that can really resonate with the experience of worsening prospects for those who have to rely on their labor to make a living. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sacha. Well, that's a great segue actually into what we want to move on to, which is we've unravelled all the problems, many of the problems and contradictions of wealth inequality. How do we begin to think about going forward from here? So that's a great link. But before we get on to the discussion about the campaign, I mean, it's such a powerful study you talked about. I mean, there could be questions and
Yeah, and thanks for that, Sacha. That was fascinating, and I never thought I'd hear Mansfield named in a seminar because I went to school in Tuxford. So it's one of the kind of feeder comprehensive schools for all the pit villages around North North. So it's fascinating and really good rendition of it from my experience of living through the miners' strike. But I think in the context of wealth, it just really highlights what a lot of the other papers have been talking about the importance of considering negative wealth together, you know, in the complexity when we think about wealth inequality, that most people's experiences of wealth is not having any. And so kind of taking that into account and the gendered nature of certainly the experience in Mansfield, where the women held those communities together and ended up with nothing. So it just kind of, it feels like it ties things together really nicely.
Yeah, absolutely. And women were often among the angriest. And like this cuts against a lot of research about like right-wing populism and the like. But in my interview materials, the people who said most vociferously that this is all corrupt, it's a racket, everything's stacked against me, how am I supposed to manage, were women with young children.
Yeah. And they also provided the soup.
Yes.
And the meals for other people to eat. So yeah, the solidarity, I suppose.
Thanks.
That was great. Thank you so much. I'm just wondering, in your conversations with people in the town, did anybody ask questions about where the wealth had gone?
Yes, and that is in part why I think those corruption narratives were so powerful, because the answer that spoke to people most was into politicians' pockets. And I think so. obviously it's ethnographic work, so I can't quite quantify this stuff, but in the conversations I had, about 1 in 3 people describe politicians as corrupt in a very literal sense. So that was a big part of it. And a general sense that, yes, there were sort of nefarious forces at play.
I think Paul, you were had your hand first.
I just wonder, to what extent does the sense of declinism, to what extent is that racialized? Because in 2015, UKIP gained a quarter of the votes in. So, yeah, I just wonder to what extent that, you know, to what extent are notions of fairness, et cetera, to what extent are they racialized or whatever?
Yeah, for a significant chunk, hugely so. Particularly when the images that people conjure of decline, it might be like, these used to be miners' cottages, they were given to people, you know, who were performing backbreaking work, and now there's 10 Polish people living in this old cottage. And like, that doesn't seem like a nice situation for workers at all. And there was some sense also that, you know, this was the fault of wrong landlords and whatnot, but there's certainly also a racialized specter of disorder at play there, right? And so I found that over the course of conversations, people often went back and forth between these quite inclusive understandings of work. It's like, if you work hard, I can only have respect for you. And this was really salient locally, and a possibility for like building forms of solidarity versus, this racialized sense of disorder. Absolutely.
I think, Armine, you gonna come?
Oh, should I go now?
Yes,
Great presentation, really interesting research. I just wanted to pick up on what you were talking about with the kind of idea of the good wealthy and the bad wealthy, and it felt like mine actually was falling firmly in the bad wealthy category. But I just wondered if you had any sense of whether there was any kind of class distinction as well between who makes up good wealthy and who makes up bad wealthy.
I think the class element of it is more, I think the perceptions of it are classed in, but particularly around these ideas of providing good jobs, ideas about having worked hard versus having inherited it. If you were able to say, like, here is a very wealthy person that never worked a day in their lives, I think the majority of the people that I spend my time with, take it all, every last cent, you know, 100% wealth tax. But yeah, so class in the sense of like, if it was someone who had built up a fortune through hard work, definitely they would be classed as good wealthy.
Danny,
Yeah, fascinating work, Sacha. I wanted to just dig in about the distrust question.
Yeah.
So say we did have an incoming new government in this country that genuinely wanted to tackle inequality, but your research shows that those political figures themselves may not be trusted. So do they have any chance of, is there a narrative that they can use to rebuild trust and gain confidence that something actually will be done? Or
yeah, so I have loads of thoughts on this, and I don't think they're popular with the Labour Party at the moment. But I think that if you want people to trust that you'll do something for them, you have to show that you're not part of politics as usual. And that presumption is so strong. People in, a good chunk of the people that I spent my time in Mansfield, just as a matter of course, did not trust politicians. Brexit was an unusual moment actually, because there was like a divide within what people perceived as the political class, which allowed us, the people who were on the Leave side, to actually prove themselves to be what people perceived as on the side of the people, right? That is unusual. I think if I were the top advisor for an incoming government, I would say you have to make a bunch of political reforms, and they would have to make some people angry, because you have to be willing to face that conflict. So for my money, that's stuff like abolishing the House of Lords, which was actually often mentioned as like a racket. There's some symbolic stuff, like drinks on the parliamentary estate are sponsored. They're cheaper than elsewhere. There's reasons for that, but I think a good symbolic policy would be to say, we get rid of those little sweeteners. I think that would play quite well, actually. It came up in interviews where people would say, oh yeah, nice, I'll be a lord, I sign in, get my £300 a day, I say aye, I leave again, have a £2.50 GMT. It's not a bad life. So there's some symbolic stuff you can do, as well as stuff that Labour is already planning around second jobs and whatnot. I think you could package those into a wider sort of platform for a new politics, as it were, to win people's trust. Because again, I remember speaking to some of my interviewees about Jeremy Corbyn, and I remember one miner's wife, an ex-nurse, saying about sort of, the Labour manifestos of 2017 and 2019. Like, they're just promising us things because they think we're dumb. You think I can't see through this? You think I can't see that you're really trying to enrich yourself and you'll just promise me anything in order to be able to do so? And that convinced me, those and other conversations convinced me that if you want people to take any of your policies at face value, any of the things that you're wanting to do, you have to first convince them that you're on their side. And that's going to have to mean taking a hard look at, what life is like for politicians versus the rest of us. That said, I know it's controversial because we don't want to play into the anti-politics too much either, right? You don't want to fan the flames.
Just a couple of minutes, non-LSE people to involved, yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We did some focus group with Salvation University of Sheffield and found very, very similar things on public attitudes to wealth, tax, and public spending, sort of deep cynicism, and also a kind of ambivalent attitude around wealth and whether it was morally right or wrong. I mean, did you get any sense around support around sort of redistribution or using the tax system as a way of fixing some of these problems? Were there any discussion or thoughts on any of that stuff? I mean, maybe neat question for your.
No. I think it's a good question, but because the work's mostly more ethnographic, in the sense of me just hanging out with people, it might shock you to learn that they didn't talk about the tax.
Okay, yes, yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to ask a question that was sort of in line with the previous one around what's the advice for parties to engage people. And I just wondered whether there was any conversation about local politicians. So the experience of councillors would be extremely different from a financial remuneration perspective than national politicians, but just whether there was either no awareness or the same perception, and the extent to which that's a sort of route in to engaging people in, those very broad neighbourhood issues, or was it just exactly the same conversation?
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting politics there. Also because my work and the work of people in Zakor and Roxana Willis really shows that there is a sort of colloquial distinction between community and politics. So on the one hand, there's the community. On the other hand, there's the politics. Those are sort of hermetically sealed from each other almost, which is very different from like early 20th century politics in Mansfield, right? I spent a lot of time with one of the Labour councillors who did a lot of community work. She was fantastic and in all sorts of ways. And she ran an allotment, I think actually, that's the allotment. But she said, I cannot present myself here as a councillor because as soon as I describe myself as a politician, people will be skeptical. So I have to say, I'm here as a member of the community. And then you were good, right? To be part of the community was to be human. Whereas to be a politician was to be like, this alien figure. Some people have campaigned around this very cleverly. So the Conservative MP who came in 2017 very much presented himself as like a local one. And someone who had a heart for Mansfield, someone who was first and foremost part of the community. Just striking because he doesn't live locally, he doesn't send his kids to school locally, and he doesn't spend that much time locally anymore. But he certainly presented himself really well, right? And it's a sign also of just how thoroughly Labour had neglected the constituency that came in with such a force. So I think, yes, councillors and people who are in some way active in the community, they were hugely respected. And there is a route there through selecting people who are not just from the area, which is what both parties have been doing very much, right? But you pick someone who worked for like the Bank of England or whatever, and you send them back to the place where they grew up, and they can say like, I'm a local person and now stand for this constituency. And I'm not saying that's always wrong, but if you really want to cut through the cynicism, you have to have someone who has local connections, which allows them to prove themselves as a good person by the standards of the community. So yeah, I definitely think that there's a role for those local infrastructures. I think there's a role for councillors. The difficult thing they're going to have to bridge, and many of them already are, is that perception that, yeah, on the one hand, the community, on the other hand, the opposition.
I think we should move on now to the final discussion, but can we, thanks, Sacha, again, that's great. So we have 25 minutes or so just to kind of, let's say, move towards a discussion around, okay, what do we do about it, you know? So partly taking stock of what we heard, thinking about the synergies between the various talks and reflections, but also partly thinking about what is to be done, to use that sort of famous quote from Lenin. And I just planted with 3 people in the room, you know, to kick us off with a few initial comments. So Branko Milanović has flown in from New York yesterday or whatever. He's made an introduction, one of, you know, a very esteemed economist. So he'll kick us off with some thoughts. And then Armine Ishkanian, the director of the Atlantic Fellows Programme, Social Economic Equity. She's an expert in civil society and social movements, and reflect perhaps on how this debate that well is configured from that perspective. And then Will Snell from the Fairness Foundation. The Fairness Foundation have been really helpful in supporting this event. And Will is going to also, I think, try and find some optimistic messages, which we're in need of. So, Branko, do you want to speak off?
Well, thank you very much. I'm come obviously totally from the outside here. So let me can I 5 minutes maybe just for some general impressions. First, the last talk basically, how should I say, leads you to be very cynical about everything, because all the talks before were actually, in some sense, activist in the sense that you can do something. The last one really sort of pours lots of cold water on that idea. So that was my first impression. I actually enjoyed that talk very much. I think it was really fascinating. Now, going back to the previous ones, the issues that I would actually sort of single out, they are not new, but one of them is, it must be true in the UK data, that actually probably 1/3 of the households have no net financial wealth. So that number, which is probably 30% or 40%, I think is striking, because you're talking about advanced capitalist economies where 1/3 of the population has actually no assets. And I would actually put that number up front in some sense. Secondly, the point that was made about several times about wealth begetting wealth. I think it's a very important point. It actually, I think, was one of the main themes throughout today's discussion. And also the fact that I think it was Andy or somebody who mentioned these really extremely high returns on high wealth. When we're talking about 8% or 10%, these are the returns which are sort of impossible to imagine for everybody who has assets below whatever it is, 1 million or 10 million or whatever. So I think that the contradiction between 1/3 of the population having 0 assets and one group actually making like 2-digit returns is, I think, very striking, and that I think has to come up very strong. Now, finally, just 1 or 2 points. Let me see. One is, when I was reading the report, the ambivalence of individualized wealth the division within a family, that actually the assets are not entirely family owned, as the point was made during the presentation, but they may be individual in the sense that even if they're technically family owned, men have a greater power over those assets, or at least they have they have their own assets, and women have their own. So that was a little bit of an ambivalence here. It's more of a philosophical point. Is it for women more empowering to have greater assets to own wealth, which is relatively small, or is it more empowering to have more access to the commonwealth, to the joint wealth? So let me do it like a trade-off. Do you prefer to have more power over 1/3 of the assets, or do you prefer to have less power overall, but then have larger bulk of assets? So it's not to me very clear that this individualization per se is more empowering for women, but I may be wrong on that. And I think what might have one more last point. Well, several last points. Maybe it's a philosophical point, which actually we talked about during the break, is what has been happening in, I think, advanced economies over the last 50 years, is that there was a formation of the large middle class wealth, but that middle class wealth really depends on two important components. One of them are pensions that came up today very clearly, which is essentially sort of financialization of the pension system. Because in the past, as you know, it used to be mostly pay as you go, and then it became, in many countries, largely or to a significant extent, private pensions sort of replace that. In wealth data, that appears, of course, now as a large middle class wealth holding. Whereas in reality, if you assume a counterfactual, where actually you have pensions being received over time and you contribute to these pensions, there is not much of a change in terms of your lifetime income, but there is a change in a formal way that you are now owning something which has been capitalized. And the second big, of course, chunk is, again, it came up today very clearly, is housing wealth. And housing wealth also is ambivalent in the sense that if you have already owned a house and you enjoy, let's suppose, utility and benefits from that house, the fact that the house went up 3 times in price, yes, maybe it would allow you maybe to sell it and do something else. But if you really need the home to live, and equivalent homes have also risen in price, it is also a little bit of a fictitious increase in wealth, because in terms, again, of underlying utility is the same. So these are sort of the two kind of, how should I say, more philosophical points. I don't think the report can do much about that, but I think it's sometimes, particularly when it comes to wealth, it's worthwhile thinking, maybe even more than when it comes to income, of more sort of underpinning, so should I say, ideological, philosophical basis to what wealth really is.
Thank you. So let's just have the 3 talks, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So take on Armine.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for inviting me to comment, and it's really interesting to hear, Branko, your feedback and perspectives. I'm going to pick up on the ideology point as well. So, the report is titled Why Wealth Inequality Matters, and I think that's a really good way of posing the question. And I guess the question is, why it matters and who cares and what's to be done, right? These are the questions. So as I was reading the report and listening to the talks, it's so important to have this data. It's so important to have this robust research. But I think, reflecting on your presentation, Sacha, it's like, well, how far does that go, right? When the politics or the political system is so kind of rigid or difficult to influence. So I think, I don't agree with you, Branko, that it was cynical or pessimistic. I think it's realistic, and which pushes us to also think about the question of, well, how does then change happen and where are the sites of change? Where, I think there was a point about the local versus the national. Oftentimes it's more possible to affect at a local level than national. And of course, we haven't even talked about the global level. And if you're talking about taxes and tax justice, you need to think about that global level. So I think, that is kind of the conversation, particularly that I think is really rich and important to have. As you were talking about, Sacha, the politics and the anti-politics, I wanted to ask a question which I didn't ask, but maybe I will now. If you were talking about kind of an anti-political stance towards formal politics, where is kind of the civic politics or social mobilization through movements and other forms of solidarity? Is there such, right? And so I wanted to kind of think through that. But also on top of that, what is the basis of solidarity? Because from your presentation, you didn't present the demographics. I was thinking, is this a completely white, working class? So then, you know, if we talk about the basis of mobilization, and that's also very politicized, you know, are they mobilizing around identity? Are they mobilizing around ideology? What ideology? Yeah. And then, or demands. And so I think, you know, that's something that is very important to kind of think with. And the final point, you know, is that all of this discussion is also unfolding within the wider cultural and political context of the so-called culture wars, right? We saw this with Sadiq Khan's election and so forth, that we're supposedly living in Londonistan, whatever they call it. And I think, you know, this whole point of you know, the war on woke, the war on identity politics, is something to consider. And again, it brings into, you know, the point I think someone made about racialization. And it was very interesting when I was reading this, you say, okay, the focus groups, they defend billionaires, especially when they're perceived to have attained their wealth through hard work, but they are preoccupied with immigration, disorder, and racialized images of decline. So, you know, it's something to really unpick and think through. So I thought that's on the one hand, and something that Michael has written about, the good versus bad billionaires, right? I think, you know, these are dynamics from not so much an economic perspective, but really from a cultural perspective, which has an influence on these perceptions, but also the possibilities and spaces where change can or can't happen. So thank you for bringing the political into it, and congratulations to all the authors on the report. So I'll stop there.
I'll give the speakers the chance to respond right at the end, okay? So just a few discussion points. Will, do you want to?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for the invitation to talk. Thank you to all the presenters and authors, really interesting discussions. I'm going to present what's hopefully a series of kind of glass half full reasons to be optimistic, but they're all caveated, so they're all kind of questions. So 4 such reasons for optimism. Firstly, and this is in terms of the prospects for taking action on wealth inequality in the UK over the next 5 years. That's my first caveat. It feels to me that the next government is going to have to increase revenues with the public spending demands require it, and it can do some of that through borrowing, but not all of it. And some of that's going to have to come from taxing wealth. That feels to me like an inevitability, and that there is clearly a substantial amount of income that can be derived from that, but also politically that's necessary as a prerequisite to broader reforms to the tax base. Discuss. Number 2, it feels also that awareness is growing across society of both the current impacts and the potential future risks that wealth inequality poses to our economy, to our democracy, to society and social cohesion, and to action on net zero. I think that there are increasing little pockets of, if you like, elites across the UK who are seriously worried about this, and that bringing some of those discussions together and thinking about what extent there's a shared analysis of the problem and potential solutions to it could be a fruitful line of inquiry. It's interesting that, you know, centre-right think tanks are putting out reports about the absence of wealth at the bottom, some of them even writing about the concentration of wealth at the top being a problem, and that there is a move in that direction. Number 3, so Sarah Kerr and Michael Vaughan at LSE put out this fantastic report and lit review last week on attitudes to wealth inequality and narratives around that, and pointed out that the absence of a sort of fixed public understanding of wealth inequality, while problematic, also presents opportunities. And we've heard a bit today about opportunities for treading some of those tightropes around, you know, balancing agency and individual opportunity with structural causes and so on, that there are ways in which we can shape that narrative in order to influence public attitudes. And fourthly, I'm not an economist, but I'm struck by the extent to which more and more economists are coming out with some of these arguments. And there was a really interesting post on the IMF website of all places by Angus Deaton a few months ago, talking about how economists, when they privilege efficiency over all other benefits, and that efficiency comes with upward redistribution, that those recommendations become little more than, as he describes, a license for plunder. And it feels to me that there's an interesting shift in that conversation, albeit one with a lot more way to go.
Thank you so much, Will. So, look, I'll give the speaker the chance to reply at the end. We've got about 5 minutes for anyone else from the floor who wants to kind of offer some reflections on what we've heard, and I think particularly kind of ways forward and how we can continue Will's kind of optimistic. Next, yeah, Michael.
Well, I just wanted to briefly pick up on the question of the cynicism or not of the last presentation, because personally, I had almost the opposite reaction, maybe close to Armine, about the kind of last presentation versus the preceding ones. And the reason is because I think that if you read a lot of papers about it, like in this area, they almost always start out with the same paragraph, and I've written this myself, which is wealth inequality is rising, and yet democracies are strangely unresponsive. And so I think that that's premised on the assumption that more information will flow naturally through the political system and result in the solutions presenting themselves. And I think to have an insight into why that is not so straightforward and why that is not happening, and with a methodology that's actually deeply humanist, I think, is a fantastic complement to the data source that is also really important to the conversation.
Can you just explain what I meant? What I meant, if the way that I understood the presentation, if a certain group of people, number of people, whatever, have an a priori position which looks cynically to any policy and proposal coming from politicians, it becomes very difficult to break that barrier. That's what I meant.
Yes.
And I think that was partly in the presentation. And that, of course, makes you sort of wonder, whatever one can do on the activist side, you will be tarred by being a politician, and then it's not going to get you anywhere. So that was what I meant by the reaction, not that that it's necessarily a good thing that it's happening.
Can I briefly respond to that?
Yeah.
That whether whether it stems pessimistic or not. Because for me, actually, for the most part, the research made me quite optimistic in that places like Mansfield have often been described as having become hugely conservative, and like the Red Wall and the rest of it, and like having abandoned progressive values. And that is definitely not true. People are concerned about inequality. They have huge investment in some type of worker solidarity. But yeah, absolutely. I think the major obstacle, as you say, as you drew out, is the sense that politicians and politics is just not trusted at all to make positive change. That said, if somebody manages to really crack it by building on those local ties and what there is locally in terms of civic organization and being part of that community, you can also see that people can swing behind fairly radical measures, and that to some extent is the theory of Brexit, which is not for me personally the radical measure I would have liked to see, but there is scope for politics and for change if we get it right. But there's a real limitation in the sense that for the most part, progressive movements don't have a base in places like Mansfield anymore. So what's being said and done locally is not feeding upwards at all.
Nima.
So there are a couple of kind of trends and lessons from today, and they overlap in really kind of, confounding, puzzling ways. One is to say that, it is becoming ever more clear that wealth begets wealth. And yet, as we see from the last presentation, I think there are these two conflicting ways in which people are deeply invested in and thinking about wealth. One, which is to say that, the extremely wealthy who didn't work for their wealth, that is incredibly unfair. But there is a story about wealth that says, it came from hard work and savings and so on, right? And how then do we, as people trying to kind of live in this space, intervene in a way, both in terms of proposals, but also in terms of rhetoric that speaks to one set of concerns without amplifying the other? Because I can immediately imagine that any attempt at proposing things like the taxation of wealth will turn into a situation where people will say, well, you worked, especially in this country where a lot of household wealth is home ownership, right? You worked hard for your house and now people want to take that away. That seems to me like a central underlying question.
Okay. All right, yes, go on, go for
I
it.
was just going to say, I think it's a really important point, and one of the things that we think in our campaigning is around messengers. And so just to point to the work of groups like the Patriotic Millionaires, for those of you who don't know, a bunch of rich people who say, please tax us more. And immediately it gets away from an argument that says you're just jealous. And so I think it's one of the things as campaigners we need to be thinking about doing is like, who's delivering the message, who are they delivering it to, and then how might it be received?
Thanks, yeah.
Just a note of optimism from the US as well. I think obviously what happens in the US in the next 6 months is a bifurcation. It could go terribly, it could go well. But one thing is certainly clear is that the Biden administration sees significant polling benefit in continually talking about a minimum tax on billionaires and legislating for it. And I think that's interesting. He keeps coming back to it, he keeps doing it, and he's tried to get it through legislation a few times. So I think to the extent that our Labour politicians have influenced by what happens in the US, I think that's something I wouldn't have expected 3 or 4 years ago. So with lots of caveats, I feel quite positive about it.
So, thank you. We'll have a chance to discuss these things in the round table later on, but just 5 minutes before the break, I just want to give the speakers who have contributed a chance to reflect and also reflect on the bigger conversations. Andy, I don't know if you want to.
I suppose just to address Will's first point of optimism, I think I broadly agree with that diagnosis that it will become untenable not to reform taxes on wealth in a context where more revenue needs to be raised from taxation. And I think part of the agenda of my work is showing that there is potentially quite a lot of money directly on the table from taxing wealth more. But politically, I think a more important point almost is Will's second point, that it's a prerequisite to raising taxes from any other source with widespread political support, that especially under a Labour government, it would be untenable to pull the usual levers that fall on quotes working people without doing those reforms to taxes on wealth. So I think I really do share Will's optimism.
Thanks, Karagiannaki. Sam and Mina, do you want to respond to anything?
I mean, I think the only thing I would say, maybe just trying to connect this to the area around social mobility. In some way, it's one of the real frustrations around working around social mobility, about the way the responsiveness of politicians to social mobility as a framing, rather than inequality for inequality's sake. But the fact remains that the incoming administration and the Tories certainly very much sign up to the social mobility agenda. And so I think if there is if wealth, the way in which wealth is clearly such an obvious impediment to equal opportunity at various levels, could be better socialized into the way policy thought operates, I think would be a useful, and as I said, I don't think it is anywhere there at the moment. I think it's potentially a useful avenue or vehicle for policy to sort of socialize issues of wealth inequality, even if personally, I would rather we were talking about wealth inequality for its own sake.
Liz?
Yeah, just coming back to this point about ideology in individualization of wealth and gendered accumulation of wealth. Well, it's kind of a double-edged sword for women, really. It's, we're moving towards a situation where it's both increasingly individualized, we're moving away from the male breadwinner model, and yet they still can't accumulate wealth equally, and still suffer many disadvantages in the process of accumulating wealth. And I'm going to borrow from the income sharing literature. There's a book called, I forget the name. I think it's called Sharing Money, Sharing Life. Modern Couples, Sharing Money, Sharing Life by Janet Stocks and colleagues. And they study sort of money sharing in 3 different contexts. So it's in the US, Spain, and one of the Nordic countries, I forget which. And these are very different in terms of expectations of familial wealth, money sharing. And yet time and time again, you hear the same reports from women. Actually, having their own income is really important to them. Sharing becomes detrimental in different ways. They don't really enjoy the same access to wealth. They don't really psychologically feel as much ownership towards it or entitlement towards it. And so similar frustrations are seen across the board. So I think we do need to pay attention to the individualized accounts and accumulation of wealth, but bearing in mind also that we also want to be worried about what's happening between households and families across the whole of the distribution. So we don't want to ignore that problem entirely. And I just want to come back to the policy question regarding housing and the right to buy. And for me, right to buy is inherently an individual solution to the problem, whereas social housing is a systematic and shared solution to the problem. And I think wealth inequality is so bad in the UK that, you know, individualized solutions aren't really going to make that much difference to the lived experience of the many. So I would argue, let's go for the social housing. If you've got to have a playoff between those things, increase the investment in social housing. And if I've got time, one final comment is I was actually on the Wealth Tax Commission with Andy, and I've recently written some reflections about the contribution that I made with my colleague Glenn Lutenheiser in a case annual review. And we prepared a paper about those that face liquidity problems, and these are perceived to be a problem of like instigating the wealth tax. And I argue in that piece that I'm like, well, actually, the liquidity problem isn't really a problem at all, because if we reconceptualize those people as people who have massive amounts of wealth and aren't currently paying much tax, then, you know, that is what the wealth tax is designed to tax. If you just wanted to tax people on their income, then you would increase income tax. It's far easier, administratively simple. So I think sometimes a reconceptualization of what it is that you're thinking about is useful for moving the conversation forward. So sorry, I've massively gone over my time there.
Yes, just on a point, I mean, arising from the point that Branko said about the 20%, 30% of the population not having financial assets. Actually, the research that I did and comparing the different ethnic groups, it is indeed not only don't having financial assets, but having negative finance, having accumulating net debt. Net debt indebtedness is actually the I mean, addressing the indebtedness, probably the way of moving forward, at least some of the people from the bottom of the distribution across all ethnic minority groups. And yeah, so this is my reflection of this.
Any more?
Yeah, I think on some level this sort of almost the authenticity of ethnography can be like, well, let's bring it back to the real world. But I actually think that that is not, for me, how all the papers and all the research that we saw today fit together. I see them very much as part of the same project, because it's part of research, but it's also part of story building, right? And part of thinking about how we narrate these things, how we present them also to wider audiences. To the point where I very much hope that some of the statistics we saw today, you might sort of, with their transformations and whatnot, eventually make their way to like a pub on a Thursday night in Mansfield where someone says, actually, did you know? And that's part of a bigger project. And to my mind, everything that we talked about today feeds into that and is hugely important and inspiring.
So, yeah, and that's absolutely the start of a conversation which is going to continue, including in a half hour's time. But before we say that, I just want to thank 2 people who have been particularly talkative. Michael has been a person who's really done all the fantastic work putting this thought together. If it hadn't been for you, we wouldn't have got this document. So I do want to thank Michael and also Miranda, who's organised this event impeccably. So can we thank those two and also all the speakers today?